There was a moment when every ancient mystery we know today had an answer. Someone knew why the stones were placed there. Someone understood where the passage led, what the symbols meant, and why an entire community spent years building something of such enormous scale. Then that knowledge began to disappear. Generations passed, explanations became legends, and eventually even the legends were forgotten. What survived was the evidence: immense walls, unusual foundations, sealed spaces, and monuments still carrying details we struggle to interpret thousands of years later. Archaeology is slowly rebuilding that lost context, but some pieces remain stubbornly absent. Today, we return to the places where the answers once existed, following the traces of ancient worlds that left their greatest questions behind. In the volcanic hills of central Italy, about 70 kilometers north of Rome, the ruins of Ferento still sit silently above the valleys near Viterbo. At first glance, Ferento looks like another abandoned Roman settlement consumed by time. But beneath its broken theatre, collapsed roads, and buried foundations lies something far more unsettling. Engineering precision that many historians believe should not have been possible with the tools available nearly 2,000 years ago. What makes Ferento especially mysterious is not simply how advanced it was, but how accurately its builders controlled water flow, terrain stability, acoustics, and construction materials in a landscape shaped by volcanic rock and unstable ground. Even today, parts of its infrastructure remain functional in principle. And among all its mysteries, one question continues to disturb archaeologists the most. How did Roman engineers achieve water gradient precision that rivals some pre-industrial modern systems without lasers, electronic surveying tools, or advanced mathematics as we understand them today? Unlike Pompeii, which was frozen instantly by volcanic ash, Ferento disappeared slowly. Historical records suggest the city prospered during the Roman imperial period and continued functioning through late antiquity. Medieval conflicts eventually led to its destruction around the 12th century, when rival forces from nearby Viterbo dismantled much of the settlement. Stones from public buildings were removed and reused elsewhere, leaving only fragments behind. Systematic excavations began during the 19th century, but major archaeological work accelerated throughout the 20th century. Excavators uncovered sections of a Roman theatre, road systems paved with basalt, drainage channels, cisterns, residential districts, and parts of a surprisingly advanced hydraulic network. Ground-penetrating radar surveys later revealed that large portions of Ferento may still remain underground. Some researchers estimate that only a fraction of the original urban infrastructure has been fully studied. The deeper archaeologists dug, the more the city began to resemble a carefully engineered machine rather than a simple Roman settlement. One of the first structures to attract scientific attention was Ferento's Roman theatre. Though partially ruined, its surviving geometry revealed extraordinary acoustic behaviour. Modern acoustic simulations conducted on Roman theatres have shown that specific curvature angles and seating elevations could amplify human speech naturally without electronic assistance. Ferento appears to follow these principles with remarkable precision. The theatre was built using volcanic stone rich in porous minerals. This material absorbs part of the low-frequency sound spectrum while reflecting mid-range frequencies associated with human voices. The result is unusually clear vocal projection. Even whispers from the stage may once have travelled dozens of meters upward through the seating rows. What makes Ferento unusual is the irregularity hidden within its symmetry. The seating tiers are not perfectly uniform. Tiny differences in height and spacing appear throughout the structure. To ancient observers, this may have looked insignificant, But modern acoustic engineers know that slight variations can reduce destructive sound reflections and improve clarity. Compared to larger Roman theatres such as those at Orange in France or Pompeii, Ferrento's theatre was smaller, yet computer reconstruction suggests its acoustic efficiency may have been disproportionately high for its size. This raises uncomfortable questions. Were Roman architects relying entirely on trial and error, or had they developed sophisticated empirical knowledge of sound propagation centuries before acoustic science formally existed? Among all the mysteries of Ferento, none is more controversial than its hydraulic engineering. The city's water infrastructure depended entirely on gravity. For water to move efficiently through channels over long distances, engineers had to maintain an extremely precise gradient. If the slope became too steep, water would erode the channels and destroy the system. If the slope became too shallow, water stagnated. Modern hydraulic systems often maintain gradients measured in mere centimeters over hundreds of meters. Astonishingly, evidence suggests Roman engineers at Ferento achieved comparable precision. Excavated channels reveal subtle but consistent slope adjustments designed to regulate water speed naturally. Some sections include what appear to be primitive pressure control basins intended to slow turbulent flow. Others show carefully calculated elevation changes that prevented overflow during seasonal rainfall. This becomes even more difficult to explain when considering the terrain itself. Ferento sits within a geologically unstable volcanic region. The ground is uneven, fractured, and difficult to survey accurately even with modern equipment. Yet Roman engineers somehow aligned water channels across this environment with extraordinary consistency. Researchers studying Roman aqueducts have measured average slopes as low as approximately 1 meter per kilometer in some systems. Achieving that level of accuracy without laser instruments would require surveying errors smaller than fractions of a degree across enormous distances. Roman engineers likely used tools such as the chorobates, a wooden leveling instrument filled with water channels, alongside weighted plumb lines and astronomical alignment techniques. But many historians argue these methods alone should not have produced the consistency observed across major Roman hydraulic networks. Ferento demonstrates the same mystery on a smaller but equally disturbing scale. Even more remarkable is the city's apparent understanding of hydraulic pressure management. Certain underground conduits widen and narrow at strategic intervals, suggesting engineers recognized how water velocity changes under confinement. This resembles principles later formalized in fluid dynamics nearly 2,000 years afterward. Comparisons with medieval European systems reveal an enormous technological gap. Many medieval towns lost the ability to maintain stable gravity-fed water infrastructure after the collapse of Rome. In some regions, water quality and sanitation standards fell dramatically for centuries. Ferento therefore represents not merely Roman competence, but evidence of engineering knowledge that much of Europe later forgot. The biggest question remains unanswered. How much theoretical understanding did Roman engineers truly possess? Were they masters of practical experimentation alone, or did they hold mathematical and observational knowledge that was never fully recorded? Another mystery lies in the material holding Ferento together. The surviving foundations contain Roman concrete mixed with volcanic ash known as pozzolana. Modern laboratory analysis has shown that when water penetrates cracks in this material, chemical reactions may generate new mineral crystals that strengthen the structure over time. This self-healing effect has stunned modern materials scientists. Ordinary Portland cement used today often deteriorates after decades of thermal expansion, chemical exposure, and moisture infiltration. Yet Roman marine structures and foundations in places like Ferento have survived for nearly 2 millennia. Microscopic studies reveal formations of calcium-aluminum silicate hydrates within Roman concrete that differ fundamentally from many modern cement compounds. Some researchers argue that Roman builders accidentally discovered an ultra-durable material chemistry through repeated experimentation with volcanic ash. Others believe the consistency of Roman concrete across multiple regions suggests intentional engineering knowledge rather than coincidence. Ferento's volcanic environment may have actually helped preserve these structures. Minerals within the local geology interacted chemically with the concrete, reinforcing its internal crystalline network instead of degrading it. Ironically, the same volcanic landscape that should have weakened the city may have contributed to its survival. Ferento also contains numerous basalt construction blocks, displaying remarkably sharp edges and flat surfaces. Basalt is one of the hardest volcanic stones used in Roman construction. Even modern steel tools require significant force and time to shape it precisely. Yet many stones at Ferento appear cut with unusual regularity. Some archaeologists believe Roman workers used thermal shock techniques, heating rock surfaces before cooling them rapidly to create controlled fractures. Others suggest specialized iron tools hardened through advanced forging methods. Still, the scale of the work remains difficult to explain. Ferento was not Rome itself. It was an important city, but not the empire's primary center of wealth or political power. And yet its engineering quality rivals infrastructure found in much larger Roman urban centers. This challenges a long-standing assumption that advanced Roman engineering existed only in major imperial capitals. Ferento suggests high-level technical knowledge may have been distributed far more widely throughout the Roman world than previously believed. What do you think? Were Roman engineers simply masters of observation and experimentation? Or did ancient civilizations possess technical knowledge far beyond what we normally imagine? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Near the contested landscapes of the Karabakh region in present-day Azerbaijan, a white stone fortress rises above dry hills and ancient ruins. Shahbulag Fortress was officially built in the mid-18th century by Pana Ali Khan, founder of the Karabakh Khanate. But almost immediately after archaeologists began excavating the area, it became clear that the fortress was hiding something far older beneath its foundations. Under the walls of Shahbulag, researchers uncovered traces of the lost ancient city of Tigranakert of Artsakh, a settlement believed to date back more than 2,000 years to the Hellenistic era. What began as the study of an 18th century military structure slowly transformed into one of the Caucasus region's most mysterious archaeological puzzles. A site where multiple civilizations may have built directly on top of each other for centuries, reusing engineering knowledge nobody fully understands today. Archaeological investigations intensified in the early 2000s when teams working around Shahbulag discovered ancient ceramics, underground chambers, cut stone foundations and defensive structures buried beneath the visible fortress. The location itself immediately raised questions. Shahbulag was strategically positioned near natural water sources and elevated terrain, offering clear visibility across surrounding valleys. Yet the deeper excavations revealed that this ideal military position had already been selected thousands of years earlier by another civilization. Ground-penetrating radar surveys later detected anomalies extending several meters below the current fortress floor, suggesting that large underground spaces may still remain hidden. Some archaeologists now believe that only a fraction of the original complex has actually been uncovered. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding Shahbulag is the precision of its stone engineering. The fortress walls were constructed from pale limestone blocks cut with remarkable uniformity. In several areas, the joints between stones are so narrow that even modern measuring tools detect gaps of only a few millimeters. This level of precision becomes even more surprising considering the mountainous terrain and the technological limitations of the 18th century Caucasus region. Historians once assumed that such stone fitting techniques required advanced metal tooling or industrial quarry systems, yet there is little evidence that builders in this region possessed machinery capable of such accuracy. The comparison that often emerges is with the polygonal masonry of Sacsayhuaman in Peru or certain retaining walls at Machu Picchu. Although Xabulag's blocks are smaller, the engineering philosophy appears strangely similar. Tightly interlocked stones designed to resist vibration and structural stress. Modern seismic studies demonstrate that irregularly interlocked masonry can distribute energy more effectively during earthquakes compared to rigid rectangular blocks. Researchers studying Xabulag found evidence that portions of the walls flex slightly under pressure instead of cracking immediately, suggesting that the builders may have intentionally designed the structure to survive regional seismic activity. This is particularly mysterious because the Caucasus Mountains sit within an active tectonic zone, where earthquakes have repeatedly destroyed settlements throughout history. Even more puzzling is how the builders transported the stone. Some individual blocks weigh several hundred kilograms and were positioned on elevated sections of the fortress with extreme balance accuracy. No large quarry directly adjacent to the fortress has been identified, meaning the material likely travelled considerable distances across uneven terrain. Engineers estimate that moving such stones without mechanised equipment would have required carefully organised labour systems, sled platforms, rollers, or inclined ramps. Yet no clear traces of these transport systems remain. Similar questions continue to surround other ancient sites such as Baalbek, where massive stones were also moved without clear evidence of the machinery involved. Another major mystery lies beneath the fortress itself. Excavations revealed tunnels, buried chambers, and subsurface passageways whose original purpose remains unclear. Some corridors appear inconsistent with the visible military layout above ground. A few tunnels terminate abruptly behind collapsed stone walls, suggesting that much larger underground systems may once have existed. Geophysical scans indicate empty cavities below several unexplored areas of the site. Researchers suspect these may represent buried storage rooms, escape routes, or even remnants of the older city beneath Xabulag. The possibility that the fortress reused older infrastructure has become one of the site's most controversial theories. Some underground walls contain masonry styles distinctly different from the visible 18th century architecture above. In deeper layers, archaeologists found stone-cutting methods more consistent with Hellenistic Armenian construction than with medieval Caucasus fortification techniques. This suggests that Xabulag's builders may have incorporated surviving foundations from much older structures, instead of constructing the fortress entirely from scratch. If true, the fortress could represent the latest layer of a settlement continuously occupied for nearly 2 millennia. The fortress water system presents another engineering puzzle. Despite standing in relatively dry terrain, Xabulag maintained reliable internal water access capable of supporting prolonged military occupation. Archaeologists discovered channels and reservoirs built with carefully calculated gradients. The slopes appear precise enough to allow water movement through gravity alone, eliminating the need for mechanical pumps. Such hydraulic planning required advanced surveying knowledge. Even a gradient error of a few degrees would disrupt water flow across the rocky landscape. Some specialists compare this system to ancient Roman hydraulic engineering, where aqueduct channels often maintained gradients of less than 1 meter per kilometer. What makes Xabulag unusual is that portions of the hydraulic system may predate the fortress itself. Several buried conduits extend beneath the layers associated with the older settlement. This raises the possibility that 18th century builders inherited and modified an already existing water infrastructure whose original designers lived centuries earlier. Similar reuse of ancient hydraulic systems occurred in places like Jerash and Ani, where later civilizations repaired and adapted much older engineering networks instead of rebuilding them entirely. The military design of Shahbalag also continues to intrigue historians. Although relatively compact, the fortress was built with defensive geometry far more sophisticated than expected for a regional stronghold of its period. Watchtowers were positioned to create overlapping fields of visibility, minimizing blind zones around the walls. Defensive angles allowed crossfire coverage across multiple approach routes simultaneously. Some military historians argue that these principles resemble early modern European bastion fortifications designed to counter artillery bombardment, yet there is limited evidence explaining how such architectural concepts spread into this region so effectively during the 18th century. The wall composition itself may also contain hidden sophistication. Analysis of surviving mortar samples revealed mixed aggregates capable of absorbing small structural shocks instead of transmitting stress directly through the stone. This resembles defensive construction techniques used in certain Ottoman and Persian fortifications, where flexibility increased durability during bombardment. The strange part is the effectiveness of the material. Portions of Shahbalag survived regional conflict, weather exposure, and seismic stress far longer than many nearby structures built during the same era. But perhaps the greatest mystery is chronological. Researchers still debate how much of Shahbalag truly belongs to the 18th century, and how much originated from earlier civilizations buried beneath it. Every excavation season seems to reveal another architectural layer older than expected. Pottery fragments, buried foundations, and defensive walls continue to push the site's timeline deeper into antiquity. Some archaeologists believe the visible fortress may simply be the outer shell of a far older complex whose original purpose has been forgotten entirely. Do you think Shahbalag Fortress was truly built in the 18th century? Or was it constructed on top of a much older lost civilization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the mountains of the South Caucasus, where earthquakes regularly fracture the landscape and wars have erased entire kingdoms from memory, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a city that should not have existed in such a place. Tigranakert of Artsakh was hidden for centuries beneath the layers of earth and collapsed stone in the region historically known as Artsakh, near modern Nagorno-Karabakh. The city is believed to have been founded during the reign of Tigranes the Great in the 1st century BCE, at the height of the Armenian kingdom. But what shocked researchers was not simply the age of the ruins, it was the engineering. Massive defensive walls stood on unstable mountain terrain. Stone blocks weighing several tons had been cut with astonishing precision. Drainage systems still followed mathematically consistent gradients after more than 2,000 years. The deeper excavations went, the more the site began to resemble a lost Hellenistic military engineering center rather than an isolated mountain fortress. The rediscovery of Tigranakert of Artsakh was unusually difficult because the region itself remained politically unstable for decades. Archaeological surveys intensified during the early 2000s when teams began examining unusual stone formations and wall alignments visible from elevated terrain. Excavations soon revealed carefully cut limestone blocks, defensive fortifications, ceramic fragments, and remnants of urban planning buried beneath the plateau. The city occupied a strategically elevated position, overlooking mountain routes connecting the Armenian highlands with the Caucasus corridor. From a military perspective, the location was ideal, yet from an engineering perspective, it was almost irrational. Building a large fortified city on fractured seismic terrain should have created enormous structural instability. Modern geologists classify parts of the Caucasus as highly active seismic zones capable of producing destructive earthquakes exceeding magnitude 6 or 7. Despite this, portions of the fortress walls survived remarkably well. Researchers immediately noticed similarities between Tigranakert and fortified Hellenistic cities influenced by Greek urban design. Some compared aspects of the masonry to fortifications found in Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. Others observed engineering parallels with mountain civilizations far beyond the Caucasus, including certain anti-seismic construction techniques later seen in Inca architecture in Peru. The possibility that ancient engineers in this isolated region independently developed comparable structural solutions became one of the site's greatest mysteries. One of the strangest features of the city is the geometry of its defensive walls. At first glance, the walls appear slightly irregular. Sections curve subtly rather than forming perfectly rigid straight lines. For years, these distortions were assumed to be the result of collapse or poor construction. But structural analysis suggested something unexpected. The walls may have been intentionally designed to absorb seismic stress. In modern earthquake engineering, rigid, straight structures are often more vulnerable because shockwaves travel through them without interruption. Curved or segmented forms can distribute force more effectively. At Tigranakert, some stone joints appear deliberately tight but not completely locked. This allowed microscopic movement between blocks during tremors. The concept resembles the famous earthquake-resistant masonry of Machu Picchu, where Inca builders used interlocking stones capable of shifting slightly during seismic activity without collapsing. Yet Tigranakert predates many medieval anti-seismic systems by more than 1,000 years. There are no surviving written records explaining how these engineers understood structural stress, resonance, or load distribution. Geological surveys also revealed that sections of the fortress were constructed directly atop bedrock ridges, rather than loose sediment. This would have dramatically improved stability during earthquakes. Such placement required advanced understanding of terrain behavior. Even today, engineers carefully select bedrock foundations for major structures in seismic regions. The fact that ancient builders applied similar principles remains deeply puzzling. The greatest mystery surrounding Tigranakert of Artsakh lies in its stonework. Some of the fortress blocks exhibit surfaces so flat and joints so narrow that researchers struggle to explain how they were produced using conventional Iron Age tools. Several blocks weighing multiple tons were shaped with near-geometric precision, despite the hardness of the local limestone. Under close examination, many cut surfaces show remarkably consistent linear abrasion patterns. These marks differ from the rough fractures typically produced by primitive hammering. Instead, they suggest prolonged controlled grinding or sawing techniques. Archaeologists proposed that workers may have used abrasive sand rich in quartz, combined with water to slowly cut through stone. Quartz ranks 7 on the Mohs hardness scale and can gradually wear down softer rock surfaces when used continuously. Similar theories have been proposed for Egyptian granite cutting methods at sites like Great Pyramid of Giza and Osirien. But the mystery becomes even more difficult when transportation is considered. Some blocks at Tigranakert likely weighed between 2 and 5 tons. Moving such material uphill through rugged Caucasus terrain without industrial machinery would have required immense coordination. Researchers estimate that moving a single multi-ton stone block on wooden sledges across uneven terrain could require dozens of workers operating in synchronized teams. Yet evidence of large-scale transport infrastructure remains limited. Even more puzzling are the near-perfect alignments between certain wall sections. Laser measurements conducted during modern surveys found deviations in some joints, measuring only a few millimeters across long surfaces. Achieving this level of precision normally requires reliable measuring systems, controlled shaping methods, and highly trained specialists. Comparisons have been made with polygonal masonry found at Sacsayhuaman, where enormous stones fit together so tightly that a blade cannot easily pass between them. Although the masonry style at Tigranakert is less complex, the principle of ultra-precise fitting appears surprisingly similar. The mystery is not merely artistic skill, it is the implied existence of advanced surveying and material processing knowledge in a region rarely associated with such engineering sophistication. Some researchers even questioned whether iron tools alone were sufficient. Experimental archaeologists attempting to reproduce comparable cuts using reconstructed ancient equipment found the process extraordinarily slow and inconsistent. Producing hundreds of blocks at this precision would have demanded enormous labour investment and organisational efficiency. This suggests that Tigranakert was not a remote outpost built casually over time. It may have been a highly strategic, state-sponsored engineering project. Unlike many mountain fortresses that evolved chaotically, Tigranakert appears to have followed a coordinated urban design. Excavations revealed organised street alignments, defensive sectors, residential zones, and administrative structures integrated into a single planned system. The road foundations are particularly revealing. Beneath visible walking surfaces, archaeologists found layered construction techniques involving compacted smaller stones intended to distribute weight and reduce erosion. This principle resembles the foundational layering methods later perfected in Roman roads. In an environment exposed to snowmelt, rainfall, and mountain runoff, such engineering would have been essential for long-term durability. Drainage channels were also carved with surprisingly stable gradients. If water channels descend too steeply, erosion accelerates and destroys the system. If too shallow, water stagnates. Measurements indicate that some channels maintained carefully controlled slopes over considerable distances. Achieving this required reliable surveying methods and practical hydraulic knowledge. The city's scale raises another unanswered question. Historical population estimates do not fully explain why such sophisticated infrastructure was necessary. Some historians believe Tigranakert may have functioned not only as a fortress, but also as a military logistics center controlling trade and movement across strategic mountain corridors. If true, the city's engineering investment begins to make more sense. Do you think the builders of Tigranakert of Artsakh developed these engineering techniques on their own, or was this lost knowledge brought from another ancient civilization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Not far from the Mediterranean coast west of Alexandria, beneath layers of drifting desert sand and collapsing farmland, archaeologists uncovered the remains of what was once one of the largest Christian pilgrimage cities on Earth. Abu Mena, built around the tomb of Saint Manaz in the 4th century AD, was not supposed to survive. The city stood on unstable clay-rich soil saturated by underground moisture, in a semi-arid environment with limited natural water sources. Yet, for nearly 1,000 years, enormous basilicas, bath complexes, storage halls, underground chambers, workshops, and pilgrimage roads remained standing across a sprawling urban centre that may have hosted tens of thousands of visitors annually. Even more disturbing to engineers today is the fact that many of the ancient structures survived far longer than the modern ground beneath them. The rediscovery of Abu Mena began in the early 20th century when German archaeologist Karl Maria Kaufmann conducted excavations between 1905 and 1907 after local reports of buried ruins southwest of Alexandria. What emerged shocked historians. Beneath the sand was an enormous Byzantine religious metropolis covering several square kilometers, centered around one of the earliest and most important Christian pilgrimage shrines outside Jerusalem. Excavations later revealed massive churches, hostels, industrial zones, baptisteries, cistern systems, and underground architectural layers stretching far beyond what researchers initially expected. But the deeper archaeologists dug, the stranger the site became. The first major mystery involved the ground itself. Modern geological surveys show that Abu Mina sits atop highly unstable clay and silt, deposits vulnerable to water saturation and subsidence. In many regions today, constructing heavy stone buildings on such soil without reinforced foundations would be considered extremely risky. Yet Abu Mina supported monumental basilicas with thick masonry walls and wide-span courtyards for centuries. Some foundation sections exceeded several meters in width, distributing the load across soft terrain in ways that resemble primitive geotechnical engineering. UNESCO eventually classified Abu Mina as a World Heritage Site in danger because rising groundwater in the modern era has caused severe structural collapse. Ironically, the ancient city remained stable for nearly 1,500 years before modern irrigation projects in the Nile Delta altered underground water levels. Entire sections that survived Byzantine wars, earthquakes, and desert erosion began sinking only after 20th century agricultural expansion increased soil saturation. This created a disturbing paradox. How could ancient builders maintain structural stability on fragile terrain longer than the modern infrastructure systems? Some engineers believe the builders understood groundwater behavior far better than previously assumed. Excavations uncovered layered foundation systems containing compacted rubble, porous fill materials, drainage channels, and hollow cavities beneath major structures. These may have functioned as pressure distribution zones or moisture control systems, reducing hydrostatic stress beneath heavy buildings. In modern engineering, similar concepts are used in floating foundations and subsurface drainage stabilization. Yet no surviving texts fully explain how these systems worked. Several underground spaces discovered beneath the basilica complex appear particularly unusual. Some chambers had no obvious religious or storage purpose. Others were positioned directly beneath load-bearing sections of major buildings. Researchers proposed multiple theories: moisture ventilation, thermal regulation, seismic pressure release, or even intentional weight redistribution. What makes the mystery more intriguing is that some void spaces were carefully integrated into the original construction rather than added later. Comparisons with Roman engineering only deepen the puzzle. Roman builders often relied on deep stone footings anchored to bedrock whenever possible. Abu Mina lacked that advantage. Instead, his architects may have developed adaptive foundation systems suited for unstable wet clay, something remarkably advanced for late antique Egypt. The deeper implication is unsettling. If these underground systems truly functioned as pressure control or moisture management technology, then the engineers of Abu Mina possessed a level of environmental understanding historians rarely associate with Byzantine-era desert settlements. Water itself forms another major mystery. Abu Mina was built in a region with limited natural freshwater access, yet historical sources describe enormous pilgrimage crowds arriving from across the Byzantine world. Pilgrims travelled from Anatolia, North Africa, Syria, Italy, and even parts of the Balkans to visit the shrine of Saint Menaz, believed to possess miraculous healing powers. Maintaining such a population in a semi-desert environment required massive logistical coordination. Archaeologists discovered large cisterns, channels, reservoirs, wells, and hydraulic installations throughout the city. Some storage systems were lined with highly durable waterproof mortar containing lime, crushed ceramics, and mineral additives similar to Roman pozzolanic concrete. Certain sections still resist water penetration after more than a millennium. Material scientists comparing Abu Mina's hydraulic coatings to Roman harbour concrete found notable similarities in salt resistance and moisture durability. However, The precise formulation of some compounds used at Abu Mina remains uncertain. The coating survived cycles of heat, salt crystallization, and groundwater exposure that destroyed many neighboring structures. How the city consistently supplied water to massive pilgrimage populations remains partly unresolved. Some historians estimate that during peak religious festivals, thousands of visitors could occupy the site simultaneously. Feeding and hydrating such numbers would have required advanced storage management far beyond what most ancient desert settlements possessed. Then there were the workshops. One of the most famous discoveries at Abu Mina involved the production of small pilgrimage flasks known as ampullae. These clay vessels, stamped with the image of Saint Menas standing between camels, were filled with holy water or sacred oil and carried across the Christian world. Tens of thousands have been discovered in Egypt, Germany, France, Italy, Turkey, and the Levant. What astonished archaeologists was the degree of manufacturing standardization. The flasks were remarkably uniform in size, shape, iconography, and firing quality. Many appear to have been mass-produced using organized workshop systems, approaching industrial-scale output centuries before mechanized manufacturing. Some researchers described Abu Mina as operating a proto-industrial pilgrimage economy. This raises another difficult question. How did a desert religious city sustain enough fuel, clay processing, labor specialization, transportation networks, and trade coordination to distribute products across the Mediterranean world at such scale? The discovery suggests Abu Mina may not have been merely a spiritual center. It may also have functioned as one of the most organized economic and manufacturing hubs in Byzantine Egypt. The city also displayed evidence of sophisticated urban planning unusual for many pilgrimage centers of the period. Roads connected major structures through carefully arranged circulation zones. Pilgrim hostels, baths, worship spaces, and commercial districts were integrated into an organized urban layout rather than chaotic expansion. Certain pathways appear designed to regulate crowd movement toward the shrine complex. Thermal engineering may have played a role as well. Some underground chambers maintained lower temperatures than surrounding surface areas, possibly through passive cooling and airflow control. Similar techniques appeared in Persian desert architecture centuries later, including wind catch systems and subterranean cooling corridors. Whether Abu Mina independently developed comparable environmental engineering remains debated. If true, the city may represent an early example of climate-adaptive architecture designed specifically for survival in harsh desert conditions. By the 7th century, political instability, changing trade routes, and religious shifts led to the decline of Abu Mina. Over time, the city was abandoned and buried beneath desert sand. Yet despite centuries of neglect, many underground structures remained intact. Modern radar surveys suggest large parts of the city are still buried beneath the surrounding terrain. Some archaeologists believe only a small portion of Abu Mina has been excavated. The site also challenges the idea that post-Roman societies lacked advanced engineering. Abu Mina reveals sophisticated knowledge of groundwater control, hydraulic materials, urban planning, and foundation engineering. Its builders managed to keep a massive city stable on weak, waterlogged soil for centuries. Tropeum Traiani stands in southeastern Romania near the Black Sea, isolated on a dry plateau where powerful winds still sweep across the hills today. The monument was first systematically studied in the late 19th century by Romanian archaeologist Grigore Tosilescu, who realized the ruins were not simply remnants of a forgotten fortress, but one of the largest Roman victory monuments ever constructed outside Italy. What immediately confused researchers was the scale of the engineering. Adam Clissi was built in one of the outermost military frontiers of the Roman Empire around 109 AD under Emperor Trajan, yet the structure displayed a level of geometric precision and stoneworking normally associated with the heart of Rome itself. Even more mysterious, many of the technologies required to build and preserve the monument for nearly 2,000 years remain only partially understood. The monument known as Tropaeum Traiani originally rose more than 30 meters high, with a diameter approaching 40 meters, making it comparable in scale to some of the largest ceremonial structures of the Roman world. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of tons of limestone were transported to the site, cut into highly uniform blocks, and assembled into a massive circular structure crowned by a colossal trophy statue. The problem is geography. Adamclisi was far from the major industrial centres of the empire. Unlike Rome, which had direct river access and enormous logistical infrastructure, this frontier region lacked the transport systems normally associated with projects of this magnitude. Researchers still debate how Roman engineers moved and positioned such enormous quantities of stone across difficult terrain without leaving behind large traces of roads, lifting systems, or permanent construction camps. Some estimates suggest individual upper structural blocks weighed several tons each, requiring coordinated lifting systems comparable to cranes used in large Roman harbours. Yet almost no surviving evidence of those mechanisms has been found at the site itself. The mystery becomes even greater when compared to other Roman megaprojects. Massive monuments such as the Colosseum or Pantheon were constructed inside wealthy urban centres, connected to rivers, ports, and organised supply networks. Adamclisi had none of those advantages, and yet, the engineering ambition appears comparable in many ways. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding Adamclisi is the monument's geometric stability. Modern laser surveys conducted during restoration work revealed that many sections of the structure maintain surprisingly consistent symmetry, despite centuries of earthquakes, freeze-thaw cycles, and erosion. Circular monuments are among the hardest architectural forms to construct accurately, because even minor errors in curvature compound over distance. Engineers studying the remains noticed that the stone courses were aligned with remarkable precision, reducing stress concentrations that normally cause ancient masonry to crack over time. In some areas, the deviation between opposing structural lines measures only a few centimeters across spans of dozens of meters. For comparison, many medieval European fortifications built more than 1,000 years later show greater structural irregularity despite access to improved metal tools. This raises a difficult question. How were Roman surveyors at Adamclisi measuring curves and load distribution so accurately in such a remote region? Roman builders did possess advanced surveying devices such as the Groma and Corobets, but some researchers believe the monument required a far more sophisticated understanding of radial geometry than surviving historical texts describe. Several architectural historians have compared the planning complexity of Adamclisi's circular layout to later Renaissance domes, especially in the way weight appears to have been distributed through concentric structural zones. Without advanced mathematical planning, a monument of this shape and size would have faced major instability within only a few centuries. The carved relief panels surrounding the monument introduce another technological mystery. Adamclisi originally contained dozens of sculpted metopes, depicting brutal battles between Roman soldiers and Dacian warriors. The detail carved into these stone panels remains astonishing even today. Facial expressions, armor textures, folds in fabric, shield patterns, and anatomical movement were executed with a depth and realism that many historians did not expect from a frontier workshop. The limestone used at the site is harder and more brittle than fine marble from Greece or Italy, making intricate carving far more difficult. Yet microscopic examinations of surviving reliefs reveal highly controlled chisel patterns and consistent cutting depth. suggesting exceptional craftsmanship and tool quality. Some metallurgical researchers believe the artisans working at Adam Cleese may have had access to iron tools hardened through advanced heat treatment techniques, not fully documented in Roman records. Experimental archaeologists attempting to reproduce similar carvings using reconstructed Roman-era tools discovered that maintaining consistent incision depth on this type of stone is extremely difficult without extremely durable cutting edges. The precision visible in the reliefs has even led some historians to argue that Roman provincial workshops were technologically far more advanced than traditional narratives suggest. In some sections, the anatomical proportions and motion realism have even been compared to later European Renaissance sculpture, despite being separated by more than 1,000 years. Another unexplained feature is the monument's long-term resistance to environmental destruction. Adam Cleese experiences severe seasonal temperature swings, powerful winds from the Black Sea region, and winter freeze cycles capable of fracturing stone. Most exposed ancient monuments deteriorate rapidly under such conditions, yet portions of the structure survived for nearly 2 millennia, despite repeated invasions, earthquakes, and weather exposure. Researchers studying the joints between blocks found that many stones were fitted with unusually tight tolerances. In several reconstructed areas, gaps between adjoining stones are so narrow that modern measuring blades can barely enter them. This degree of precision dramatically reduces water infiltration, one of the primary causes of structural damage in ancient masonry. Once water penetrates stone joints and freezes, expansion gradually destroys the internal stability of a monument. The fact that Adam Cleese resisted this process for centuries suggests Roman engineers possessed a deep practical understanding of climate-resistant construction. Some specialists compare the stone fitting methods at Adam Cleese to polygonal masonry seen in sites such as Sacsayhuaman, where precise stone contact minimized structural weakness without modern cement technology. Although the techniques differ, both sites demonstrate ancient engineering solutions that remain difficult to fully replicate today. The monument's symbolism also presents unanswered questions. Unlike the highly refined artistic style typical of Rome, the carvings at Adam Cleese appear harsher, heavier, and more aggressive. Some scholars believe this reflects local artistic influence from Dacian or Thracian traditions. Others argue the style may have been intentional psychological warfare. The monument was constructed near the frontier where Rome had suffered devastating military losses before Trajan's campaigns. Ancient sources suggest earlier Roman armies may have lost tens of thousands of soldiers in conflicts within this region. By building an enormous circular victory monument visible from great distances, Rome may have been projecting permanent dominance through architecture itself. Some historians compare Adam Cleese to later imperial propaganda structures such as the Arc de Triomphe, though Adam Cleese predates it by more than 17 centuries. The difference is that Adam Cleese was not built inside a peaceful capital city. It stood directly on a violent frontier where Rome needed to constantly intimidate surrounding populations. If local craftsmen participated in the project, it could explain some of the monument's unusual design choices. Certain decorative motifs differ sharply from mainstream Roman artistic conventions. This has led to speculation that Adam Cleese represents a fusion of Roman engineering with regional construction traditions now largely lost to history. If true, the site challenges the common belief that technological innovation in the ancient world flowed only outward from major imperial capitals. Instead, Adam Cleese may preserve evidence that frontier regions developed unique engineering methods adapted to local conditions, climates, and materials. This possibility is particularly important because many ancient frontier technologies may have vanished completely after wars, migrations, and the collapse of Roman authority in the Balkans. Unlike Rome itself, frontier regions rarely preserve detailed written technical records. Do you think Adam Cleese was built using engineering knowledge that has completely disappeared from history? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. The ruins of Thulamela sat untouched for centuries among the granite hills of northeastern South Africa's Kruger National Park. Massive dry stone walls still stand across the hilltop, surrounding what was once a powerful trading city connected to gold, international commerce, and advanced metallurgy. What makes Thulamela disturbing is not simply its age, but the fact that many of its engineering methods still cannot be fully explained. Thulamela was rediscovered in 1983 by Ranger Johan Heine while patrolling a remote section of Kruger National Park. Archaeologists later confirmed that the settlement flourished between approximately 1250 and 1700 AD, during the same era as Great Zimbabwe. Excavations during the 1990s uncovered imported Chinese porcelain from the Ming dynasty, glass beads linked to Indian Ocean trade networks, iron tools, gold ornaments, and royal burials. The findings immediately challenged older assumptions that southern African civilizations were technologically isolated before European arrival. The first unexplained feature of Thulamela is its architecture. The city was built using dry stone masonry, meaning thousands of granite rocks were stacked without mortar, cement, or binding material. Despite centuries of rain, erosion, and seasonal temperature swings exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, many walls still remain standing. Some retaining walls reach nearly 2 meters in height and curve naturally along the hilltop terrain with surprising structural stability. Archaeologists noticed that the stones were not randomly stacked. Many appear deliberately selected and shaped to interlock under pressure, distributing weight in ways similar to seismic-resistant masonry techniques found in Peru or at Mycenaean sites in Greece. What confuses researchers is the precision achieved without iron chisels advanced enough for fine stone shaping. Experimental archaeology suggests that constructing walls of this scale would have required coordinated labor forces, careful geometric planning, and deep understanding of load distribution. Certain wall sections even appear slightly inclined inward, a technique used in later fortified architecture to resist collapse. The comparison to Great Zimbabwe is unavoidable. Both sites use nearly identical dry stone engineering principles despite being separated by more than 300 kilometers. This has led some historians to propose the existence of a larger regional knowledge network spreading architectural techniques across southern Africa centuries before colonial contact. One of the most mysterious discoveries at Thulamela involves evidence of gold and iron processing. Excavations uncovered furnace remains, slag deposits, charcoal concentrations, and traces of metalworking activity across the settlement. Yet the surrounding environment creates a major engineering problem. Modern reconstructions show that iron smelting typically requires temperatures above 1,200 degrees Celsius. Gold refining also demands controlled heat and oxygen flow. But Thulamela existed in a relatively dry savanna ecosystem, where large-scale fuel production should have been difficult. Maintaining industrial-level temperatures for repeated metalworking operations would have consumed enormous quantities of charcoal. Researchers studying African bloomery furnaces discovered that some pre-colonial smelting systems used natural airflow engineering instead of mechanical bellows. Certain furnace orientations exploited wind direction to intensify combustion temperatures. Some scholars believe Thulamela's metalworkers may have mastered similar aerodynamic systems. If true, it would mean these craftsmen developed efficient thermal engineering techniques largely absent from written history. Chemical analysis of slag fragments also revealed surprisingly consistent mineral composition, suggesting controlled production rather than primitive experimentation. This level of consistency resembles organized metallurgical systems, rather than isolated village craftsmanship. Even more puzzling is the scale of the gold economy. Gold objects discovered at Thulamela indicate access to stable mining and refining operations, yet very few nearby extraction sites have been conclusively identified. Some archaeologists suspect hidden mining zones may still exist within the broader Limpopo region. The most shocking mystery at Thulamela emerged from royal burials excavated in 1996. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man and woman believed to belong to the ruling elite. Buried beside them were hundreds of gold beads, bracelets, necklaces, and delicately crafted ornaments unlike anything expected from a supposedly isolated medieval settlement. Several gold pieces were astonishingly thin. Some beads were formed from hammered sheets so delicate that modern researchers questioned how such uniformity could be achieved using only basic hand tools. Under magnification, certain surfaces displayed extremely even compression patterns, suggesting highly controlled shaping techniques. Gold is naturally soft, but producing thin ornamental sheets without cracking requires careful temperature management and repeated annealing, a process where metal is heated and cooled to restore flexibility. The mystery is that archaeologists found little direct evidence of advanced jewelers' equipment capable of such precision. This has led to several theories. Some researchers believe artisans used specialized organic tools made from hardwood, bone, or leather that decomposed long ago. Others suspect lost thermal treatment methods allowed repeated reshaping without damaging the metal. There are even debates about whether regional goldsmiths passed knowledge through tightly controlled guild systems, similar to those seen in medieval Asia and the Middle East. The craftsmanship becomes even more extraordinary when compared to contemporary European jewellery from the same period. While medieval European goldwork often relied heavily on moulds and casting, many Thulamela artifacts appear manually hammered and polished with remarkable consistency. The precision suggests generations of accumulated metallurgical knowledge rather than occasional decorative work. What disturbs historians most is that this entire technological tradition nearly vanished from recorded history. Unlike Egypt, Rome, or China, Southern African metallurgy was poorly documented by outsiders before colonial expansion. Entire engineering systems may have disappeared before they were ever properly studied. Another unresolved mystery is how Thulamela sustained a large population on a rocky hilltop in a region prone to seasonal droughts. Archaeological evidence suggests the settlement supported elite structures, trade activity, metalworking zones, and permanent occupation for centuries. Yet no major river runs directly through the site. Some researchers believe the inhabitants engineered rainwater harvesting systems using natural granite depressions and hidden runoff channels carved into the rock. Others suggest underground storage pits may once have existed but were destroyed by erosion over time. Satellite surveys around southern African archaeological sites have revealed ancient water control systems far more sophisticated than previously believed. Similar adaptations were found in parts of the Sahel, where civilizations developed seasonal retention systems capable of storing water for months. If Thulamela employed comparable methods, it would represent another example of advanced environmental engineering developed independently in Africa. The hilltop location itself may also have served climatic purposes. Elevated granite surfaces cool rapidly at night, potentially reducing heat stress while improving visibility against approaching threats. This combination of defense, trade control, and environmental adaptation suggests deliberate urban planning rather than random settlement growth. One of the most shocking discoveries at Thulamela is the evidence of international trade networks. Archaeologists found glass beads from India and Persia, along with Ming Dynasty Chinese ceramics, proving that Thulamela was connected to Indian Ocean trade routes centuries before Europeans moved deep into the region. These trade routes may have linked Thulamela to coastal ports near present-day Mozambique through Swahili merchants. This shows the settlement was not isolated, but a highly organized economic center controlling resources, labor, and large-scale gold trade. What do you think really caused the disappearance of Thulamela? Drought, collapsing trade routes, or something historians still haven't discovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Madinat al-Zahra was once the most dazzling city in Western Europe. Built in the 10th century by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Rahman III, near Córdoba in southern Spain, the palace city reportedly shimmered with marble gold, pools of liquid reflections, and halls engineered to manipulate light itself. Then, less than 80 years later, it vanished into ruin. Today, more than 90% of the site still remains buried underground, and archaeologists believe some of its most advanced engineering secrets may still be hidden beneath the hills outside Córdoba. The ruins of Madinat al-Zahra were rediscovered in 1911 by Spanish archaeologist Ricardo Velázquez Bosco after centuries of local legends describing buried palaces beneath the farmland west of Córdoba. Excavations soon uncovered massive reception halls, carved marble columns, hydraulic systems, gardens, and fragments of decorative stonework so refined that many historians compared them to Byzantine imperial architecture. What shocked researchers most was the scale. Historical records suggest the city covered nearly 112 hectares, making it vastly larger than most royal complexes in medieval Europe. Yet only around 10% has been excavated, meaning the overwhelming majority of the city, including possible workshops, underground conduits, and ceremonial sectors, remains unexplored. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding Madinat al-Zahra is how quickly it was constructed. Historical texts claim thousands of workers operated continuously, with as many as 10,000 labourers and over 1,000 animals transporting stone and materials every day. Some chroniclers describe construction progressing at a pace almost unimaginable for the 10th century. Entire palace sectors covered in marble and intricate carvings appeared within decades. Compared to contemporary European cities, the contrast is staggering. During the same period, much of Western Europe was still dominated by relatively small stone fortifications and timber structures. Yet Madinat al-Zahra featured sophisticated urban planning, formal gardens, terraced architecture, advanced water distribution, and monumental ceremonial spaces designed with mathematical precision. Historians often compare Córdoba itself to Constantinople, because both cities possessed paved roads, public baths, libraries, and hydraulic infrastructure at a level rarely seen elsewhere in Europe at the time. The city's water engineering remains one of its most technically mysterious features. Madinat al-Zahra was built on a sloping terrace system along the foothills of the Sierra Morena Mountains. Engineers used gravity-fed hydraulic channels to distribute water across multiple elevations, powering fountains, reflective pools, irrigation systems, and palace baths simultaneously. Archaeologists discovered ceramic pipes, underground conduits, reservoirs, and carefully angled channels with gradients so precise that some vary only slightly over long distances. Maintaining stable water pressure across a terraced complex in a semi-arid climate would have required extraordinary calculations. Modern hydraulic engineers studying the ruins noted that even small deviations in channel slope could have disrupted flow rates entirely. Some researchers compare the engineering challenge to Roman aqueduct systems, yet Madinat al-Zahra integrated these hydraulic mechanisms directly into ceremonial architecture. Water was not merely functional, it became part of the visual illusion of power. But the most fascinating mystery of all may be the city's manipulation of light. Medieval Islamic chronicles described halls where sunlight shimmered across polished marble and metallic surfaces so intensely that visitors believed the rooms were moving. One famous account described a reception hall containing reflective pools and decorative materials that caused light to ripple, like lightning across water. For years, many historians dismissed these descriptions as exaggerated royal propaganda. However, archaeological evidence increasingly suggests the architects of Madinat al-Zahra may have intentionally engineered optical effects through the strategic placement of reflective materials and sunlight angles. The palace complex used enormous quantities of white marble imported from North Africa and other Mediterranean regions. White marble possesses high reflectivity, especially under the intense Andalusian sun. Combined with polished stucco, glazed ceramics, reflective pools, and metallic decorative elements, the architecture may have functioned almost like a massive optical instrument. Some halls appear carefully oriented to maximize natural illumination during specific times of day. Researchers studying solar movement at the site observed that sunlight entering through arches and openings could strike polished surfaces at controlled angles, dramatically amplifying brightness inside ceremonial chambers. This phenomenon resembles principles used in modern architectural lighting design, where reflective materials manipulate perception and emotional response. The so-called Rich Hall, one of the most luxurious structures excavated at the site, demonstrates this especially well. Its carved vegetal patterns, geometric reliefs, and polished surfaces create constantly shifting shadows as sunlight moves throughout the day. The effect is surprisingly dynamic. Instead of static decoration, the hall appears visually alive. Some scholars suggest the architects understood how sunlight interacted with carved depth, reflective surfaces, and water reflections to create psychological impact. Even more intriguing are historical descriptions mentioning pools filled with mercury or highly reflective liquids capable of producing moving flashes of light. While direct archaeological proof remains inconclusive, similar reflective experiments are documented elsewhere in medieval Islamic engineering traditions. If true, Madinat al-Zahra may have employed deliberate sensory manipulation centuries before modern theatrical architecture existed. The precision of the decorative stonework adds another layer to the mystery. Thousands of carved marble fragments recovered from the site display astonishing symmetry and consistency. Floral motifs repeat with near-identical geometry over massive areas. Historians studying the carvings have questioned how artisans working entirely by hand achieved such standardization on such a large scale. Some experts believe the craftsmen used advanced geometric templates and modular design systems far more sophisticated than typically associated with 10th century Europe. Islamic mathematicians during this era were already developing complex geometric theories, including tessellation principles that would later influence Moorish architecture across Spain. Certain repeating patterns at Madinat al-Zahra display mathematical regularity comparable to later Islamic masterpieces such as the Alhambra in Granada. The logistics behind the city remain equally astonishing. Historical accounts mention marble columns arriving from Tunisia, Italy, and even Byzantine territories. Transporting thousands of heavy columns across the Mediterranean and then inland to Cordoba would have required immense coordination. Researchers estimate some columns weighed several tons each. Moving them uphill into the terraced palace complex without modern machinery remains difficult to fully reconstruct. Archaeologists are also puzzled by the speed with which the city disappeared. Around the early 11th century, civil war erupted across Al-Andalus during the Fitna period. Madinat al-Zahra was looted, burned, dismantled, and gradually abandoned. Valuable marble and columns were stripped away and reused in later structures throughout the region. Over centuries, the ruins were buried under soil and forgotten almost completely. Yet despite the destruction, modern surveys indicate vast sections remain untouched underground. Ground-penetrating radar has identified buried walls, foundations, and unexplored sectors extending far beyond the excavated areas. Some researchers suspect hidden hydraulic chambers, workshops, or ceremonial structures may still survive beneath the landscape. What do you think is still hidden beneath Madinat al-Zahra lost technology? Forgotten engineering knowledge, or something even more mysterious? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hasanu Tepe sits near the southern edge of Lake Urmia in northwestern Iran, where archaeologists uncovered one of the most violently preserved ancient cities ever found. Around 800 BCE, the entire settlement was destroyed in a catastrophic fire so sudden that people died where they stood, leaving behind frozen moments of panic buried beneath collapsed mud brick and burning timber. Nearly 3,000 years later, Hassanlu still contains mysteries that modern archaeology and engineering cannot fully explain. The site was first excavated systematically in the 1950s by Robert H. Dyson Jr. from the University of Pennsylvania. Beneath multiple occupation layers, archaeologists uncovered a major Iron Age city destroyed in a single event. Entire rooms remained sealed under debris. Human skeletons were discovered trapped in stairways, alleyways, and collapsed halls. Unlike many ancient ruins slowly abandoned over centuries, Hassanlu looked as if time had stopped in one night. The destruction layer itself became one of the greatest archaeological time capsules of the ancient Near East. The deeper researchers studied Hassanlu, the stranger the site became. The fire that destroyed Hassanlu was not an ordinary urban fire. Evidence from burned timber, vitrified mud surfaces, and collapsed architecture suggests temperatures may have exceeded 800 degrees Celsius in some sections, comparable to temperatures used in primitive industrial firing processes. Mud brick structures normally disintegrate rapidly when exposed to centuries of moisture and freeze-thaw cycles. Yet many Hassanlu walls survived in recognizable form for nearly 3 millennia. Archaeologists believe the destruction itself may have accidentally preserved the city, because the intense heat likely hardened portions of the mud brick in a process similar to low-temperature ceramic firing. This phenomenon has been compared to partially fired mud brick structures found at sites in Mesopotamia, but Hassanlu's preservation is unusually extensive. Some walls collapsed inward while still structurally semi-rigid, trapping entire rooms beneath sealed debris layers. Organic materials, including wooden beams and food remains, were preserved in carbonized form because oxygen levels rapidly dropped beneath the rubble. Researchers still debate how the fire spread so quickly through such a large settlement. Some believe attackers deliberately targeted roof supports and storage zones to create chain reaction collapses, while others suspect the architecture itself unintentionally amplified the destruction. Large timber-reinforced mud brick buildings may have functioned like enormous furnaces once ignited. The most famous object ever discovered at Hassanlu is the Hassanlu Gold Bowl, found clutched by a man who died while apparently trying to escape the burning city. Weighing nearly 1 kilogram and made from high-purity gold, the bowl is covered with intricate mythological scenes hammered into the metal with astonishing precision. What makes the artifact extraordinary is not simply its beauty, but the technical sophistication required to manufacture it around the 9th century BCE. The bowl was likely produced using repousse and chasing techniques, where craftsmen hammered designs from the reverse side and refined details from the front. However, metallurgical analysis suggests an unusually advanced level of control over gold thickness and stress distribution across the surface. In many ancient repousse works, repeated hammering creates weak points, uneven surfaces, or microfractures. Yet the Hassanlu bowl displays remarkably consistent structural integrity despite its dense relief imagery. Some sections contain extremely fine raised details only millimeters deep, requiring controlled force distribution across thin gold sheets without tearing the metal. Even modern restorers note how difficult it would be to reproduce the bowl accurately using reconstructed Iron Age tools alone. The symmetry of the imagery also raises questions, because several circular compositions maintain highly balanced spacing, despite being executed entirely by hand. Without modern calipers, precision grids, or optical measuring systems, maintaining proportional continuity around a curved golden surface would have required extraordinary planning. Comparisons with Assyrian and Eurasian metalwork from the same period show similarities in iconography, yet the Hassanlu bowl often appears technically more refined in depth transitions and compositional density. Some researchers believe the craftsman may have inherited older metallurgical traditions now completely lost. Even more mysterious is the gold itself. Trace element analysis suggests the metal may have originated from multiple ore sources, implying long-distance trade networks or sophisticated recycling practices. At a time when transportation across the Zagros region was extremely difficult, Hassanlu somehow had access to elite materials and artisans capable of working them at near masterpiece level. To this day, archaeologists still cannot fully explain how craftsmen prevented deformation during deep repousse work, how they controlled heating and annealing cycles without modern temperature measurement, how they achieved such uniform thickness across large hammered sections, or how such advanced artistry emerged in what was supposedly a peripheral highland settlement rather than an imperial capital. The bowl feels less like an isolated artwork and more like surviving evidence of a technical tradition mostly erased from history. Hassanlu stood in a tectonically unstable region where earthquakes were common, yet several major structures show evidence of engineering strategies that appear unusually resilient for the Iron Age. Many walls were constructed with thick mud brick exteriors reinforced internally by timber frameworks, a combination resembling anti-seismic techniques later seen in Persian and even some medieval Middle Eastern architecture. Wood absorbs and redistributes vibrational energy more flexibly than solid masonry alone. Some collapsed walls bent and folded instead of exploding outward into fragmentation. Structural engineers studying ancient earthquake damage patterns note that this behavior suggests partial energy dissipation inside the wall cores. At other Near Eastern sites from the same era, pure mud brick construction often failed catastrophically during seismic activity, but Hassanlu's hybrid structural methods may have significantly improved survival rates during smaller tremors. The mystery is whether these builders truly understood seismic behavior experimentally, or whether the design evolved accidentally through generations of reconstruction after repeated earthquakes. Either explanation implies a level of architectural adaptation more sophisticated than traditionally assumed for Iron Age settlements. Standard mud brick architecture deteriorates relatively quickly in regions exposed to seasonal moisture and winter freezing. Northwestern Iran experiences harsh winters, temperature variation, and periodic precipitation, conditions normally destructive to unfired earthen structures. Yet Hassanlu's destruction layer remained remarkably stable. Material analysis revealed unusually dense mud brick mixtures containing fine mineral inclusions, organic fibers, and carefully sorted clay compositions. Some samples exhibit compressive strengths noticeably higher than standard Near Eastern mud brick from comparable periods. Researchers suspect builders may have intentionally added volcanic ash, silica-rich sediments, or plant fibers to reduce cracking during drying. Similar stabilizing principles appear later in Persian Saruj mortar, and Roman pozzolanic concrete, though Hassanlu predates many famous examples of advanced ancient composite materials. The consistency of the mixtures suggests standardized production methods rather than random local improvisation, implying skilled material specialists existed within the settlement. Hassanlu was not Babylon or Nineveh, yet the number of elite artifacts discovered there suggests access to wealth, trade and skilled labour far beyond what archaeologists expected from a regional settlement. Imported materials, luxury goods, weapons, and complex storage systems indicate Hassanlu held a strategic position between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau. Large storage rooms and administrative ceilings point to organised food management and bureaucratic control over trade and resources. What makes this difficult to explain is that Hassanlu thrived in a mountainous frontier region, surrounded by constant warfare between Assyria, Urartu, and local powers. Despite that instability, the city maintained a level of economic organisation and technical sophistication far beyond what its size would normally suggest. Who do you think truly destroyed Hassanlu? And how much ancient knowledge may have vanished in that single night of fire? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Al-Balid Archaeological Park stands on the southern coast of Oman, where desert cliffs meet the Arabian Sea. Today the ruins look silent and fragile, but nearly 1,000 years ago this was one of the richest ports on Earth. Ships crossed thousands of kilometres of dangerous ocean to reach it for a substance once valued almost like gold: frankincense. What archaeologists discovered beneath the sand was not just a lost trading city, but evidence of engineering systems, climate adaptation, and preservation technologies that still remain partially unexplained. The ruins of Al-Balid were systematically investigated during the 20th century after scholars connected the site to medieval Arab records describing the prosperous port of Zafar. Excavations uncovered fortified walls, mosques, storage complexes, harbour structures, drainage systems, and imported ceramics from China, Persia, East Africa, and India. Radiocarbon analysis and ceramic studies suggest the city flourished between the 8th and 16th centuries CE during the peak of the Indian Ocean trade network. But the deeper archaeologists excavated, the stranger the site became. This is the greatest technological mystery surrounding Al-Balid. Frankincense is not an ordinary trade good. It is a resin harvested from boswellia trees growing in harsh environments across southern Oman and parts of Yemen. In the ancient world, it was burned in temples, used in embalming rituals, medicine, perfume production, and elite ceremonies. Roman historians described Arabian frankincense as one of the most valuable substances entering the Mediterranean world. But frankincense presents a major problem. The resin rapidly degrades when exposed to excessive humidity, unstable temperatures, salt air, or microbial contamination. Long-distance maritime transport across the Arabian Sea should have damaged massive quantities of cargo, yet historical records repeatedly describe Omani frankincense arriving in remarkably high condition, even after voyages lasting weeks or months. At Al-Balid, archaeologists discovered evidence suggesting the city may have possessed advanced passive preservation systems far beyond what historians once assumed medieval Arabian ports could achieve. Some storage buildings contain unusually thick walls, narrow ventilation corridors, airflow-oriented layouts, and chambers positioned according to prevailing monsoon winds. Researchers noticed that certain warehouses appear designed to stabilize internal temperatures naturally, resembling principles seen in Persian wind catchers, Roman passive cooling systems, and even modern climate-responsive architecture. In some areas, Wall thickness changes depending on exposure to sunlight and seasonal wind direction, suggesting the builders understood thermal transfer with surprising sophistication. Modern studies on traditional Arabian construction show that thick lime-plastered walls can reduce interior temperature fluctuations by several degrees Celsius. Combined with controlled airflow, this could have dramatically slowed resin degradation. The mystery becomes even more significant when considering scale. Historical estimates suggest tons of frankincense move through southern Arabia annually. Ancient Roman sources claim the incense trade generated enormous state revenues, while Pliny the Elder described caravans protected almost like military operations. Al-Balid may have functioned as one of the critical maritime gateways connecting this trade to India and East Africa. Yet archaeologists still do not fully understand how such enormous quantities were preserved consistently in a humid coastal environment. Some researchers suspect the use of mineral-based sealing compounds, organic antifungal coatings, specialized ceramic storage containers, or controlled airflow engineering now lost to history. The site increasingly resembles a forgotten industrial center rather than a simple medieval port. One of the strangest aspects of Al-Balid is that the city survived for centuries in an environment that should have been extremely destructive to urban infrastructure. The Dhofar coast experiences salt-heavy air, seasonal monsoon moisture, intense heat, and shifting groundwater conditions. Most coastal settlements exposed to these conditions suffer rapid structural decay. Salt penetrates stone and brick, expands during crystallization, and gradually destroys walls from within. Even modern concrete suffers heavily under such conditions. Yet parts of Al-Balid remained structurally stable for hundreds of years. Archaeologists discovered drainage channels and water control systems, suggesting careful management of groundwater and seasonal flooding. Some foundations appear elevated or layered in ways that reduce salt intrusion. This has led to comparisons with Roman marine engineering, Nabatean water systems at Petra, and Persian Saruj waterproof mortar technologies. Certain surviving plaster fragments contain unusually durable lime mixtures that resisted erosion far longer than expected. Researchers believe local builders may have combined shell-derived lime, ash, and mineral aggregates to create materials adapted specifically for coastal humidity. The engineering logic behind the city appears highly specialized for climate survival. Al-Balid became wealthy because it stood at the center of one of the most dangerous maritime trade systems of the ancient and medieval world. The Arabian Sea is heavily influenced by monsoon cycles. Winds reverse seasonally, currents shift dramatically, and storms can become catastrophic. Navigating these waters without advanced instruments should have been extraordinarily risky. Yet merchants operating from southern Oman maintained trade connections extending west toward East Africa, east toward India, and north toward the Persian Gulf. Excavations uncovered imported ceramics from China's Song and Ming periods, showing that Al-Balid participated in trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. The mystery is not simply that these voyages existed, the mystery is their consistency. To maintain profitable trade over centuries, navigators needed accurate understanding of monsoon timing, stellar navigation, ocean currents, seasonal humidity, and cargo preservation. Arab navigators later became famous for celestial navigation techniques using stars and angular measurements, but some historians believe this knowledge may have originated from much older maritime traditions developed in ports like Al-Balad. This raises a larger question: how much ancient oceanographic knowledge has been lost? The architecture of Al-Balid appears designed not for beauty alone, but survival. Many structures use compact street layouts, controlled airflow corridors, strategic wall orientation, and materials optimized for thermal regulation. This resembles techniques later seen across Islamic desert architecture. Some researchers argue that cities like Al-Balid mastered passive cooling centuries before industrial ventilation existed. Certain building remains indicate an understanding of solar exposure, shadow management, heat absorption, and nighttime cooling cycles. In modern sustainability research, passive cooling systems inspired by Middle Eastern architecture can reduce indoor temperatures by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius without mechanical air conditioning. That makes Al-Balid remarkable because its builders achieved environmental adaptation using only stone, lime, airflow, geometry, and local materials. No electricity, no machines, and no modern engineering software existed, yet the city functioned for centuries in one of the harshest coastal climates in Arabia. Perhaps the greatest unanswered question is why such a wealthy city disappeared. Historical evidence suggests Al-Balid declined between the 15th and 16th centuries. Trade routes shifted, political instability increased, and some evidence points toward destructive conflict. But archaeology reveals a more complicated story. Certain areas show burning damage, others appear gradually abandoned, and some sections were buried unusually quickly by sand accumulation. Researchers proposed multiple explanations, including regional warfare, economic collapse, climate change, disease, or changing maritime routes after the rise of Portuguese naval power. Yet no single theory explains everything. A city that once controlled one of the world's most valuable trade commodities simply faded into silence. And beneath the ruins remained signs of engineering knowledge that still has not been fully reconstructed. Do you think Al-Balid was simply an ancient trading city, or the remains of a forgotten technological civilization that understood climate preservation and maritime engineering far better than we realize today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Assos Necropolis lies on the Aegean coast of northwestern Turkey, where thousands of stone coffins once left one ancient city and spread across the Roman world. But the greatest mystery was never the dead buried inside them. It was the stone itself. Ancient writers claimed bodies placed inside these sarcophagi decayed with unnatural speed, reducing to skeletons in only a few weeks. More than 2,000 years later, archaeologists still debate whether Assos accidentally discovered a form of natural biochemical decomposition centuries before modern science understood bacteria, minerals, or microbiology. The ruins of Assos were systematically identified by European travelers during the 18th and 19th centuries, but major excavations accelerated after the American archaeological campaigns, led by Joseph Thatcher Clark and Francis H. Bacon in the 1880s. As excavators cleared the necropolis surrounding the ancient city, they uncovered hundreds of massive stone sarcophagi carved from local volcanic andesite. Many were unfinished, others appeared prepared for export. What emerged was not simply a cemetery, but evidence of a large-scale industrial stone operation connected to Mediterranean trade routes more than 2,000 years ago. The first and most disturbing mystery became known in antiquity itself. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder described Assos stone coffins as sarcophagi, literally flesh-eating stones. According to ancient accounts, corpses buried inside decomposed unusually fast, sometimes leaving only bones within roughly 40 days. While ancient writers often exaggerated, the persistence of the claim across multiple Roman sources suggests the phenomenon was widely observed rather than invented mythology. Modern geology offers partial explanations but not complete certainty. The sarcophagi were carved from volcanic andesite rich in minerals and microscopic pore networks. Unlike dense marble, porous volcanic stone can absorb moisture and accelerate airflow around organic material. Some researchers believe the rock may have created conditions favourable for aerobic bacterial activity, dramatically increasing decomposition rates. In effect, the stone may have functioned as a natural dehydration chamber combined with microbial acceleration. What makes this extraordinary is the historical context. Ancient civilizations usually obsessed over preserving bodies. Egyptians spent nearly 3,000 years refining mummification techniques designed to stop decay entirely. Natron salts removed moisture while resins sealed tissue against bacteria. Yet Assos appears to represent the opposite philosophy, accelerating destruction instead of preventing it. Two ancient cultures separated by geography and belief, both manipulated decomposition with remarkable effectiveness, one slowing time, the other speeding it up. Even today, forensic decomposition rates vary enormously depending on humidity, temperature, bacteria, oxygen, and soil chemistry. In modern outdoor conditions, full skeletal reduction can take months or years. Under dry desert conditions, tissue may naturally mummify instead of decomposing. Yet the Assos reputation persisted strongly enough that wealthy Romans imported these coffins across the Mediterranean specifically for burial. That implies the effect was visible enough to become commercially valuable. The second mystery involves the stoneworking itself. Andesite is significantly harder than limestone and much more difficult to carve. On the Mohs hardness scale, andesite often approaches hardness levels near basalt, meaning tools wear down rapidly during cutting. Yet Assos craftsmen produced enormous sarcophagi with relatively smooth interior walls, sharply cut edges, and fitted lids weighing multiple tons. Some unfinished examples reveal systematic quarrying methods rather than random carving. Workers appear to have separated blocks using channels and controlled fracture lines before shaping the coffins with iron chisels and hammerstones. The precision becomes difficult to explain at industrial scale. Producing a single massive coffin would already require immense labour. Assos produced hundreds. The logistics become even more mysterious when examining distribution patterns. Archaeologists have identified Assos sarcophagi far beyond the city itself, including sites in Alexandria, the Levant, Anatolia, and parts of the Balkans. Transporting multi-ton volcanic coffins through mountainous terrain toward coastal ports would have required advanced coordination systems. Even modern engineers recognize the difficulty of moving concentrated stone loads without cranes, hydraulic lifts, or mechanized transport. Ancient Roman merchant ships could carry heavy cargo, but loading operations remain difficult to reconstruct. Some historians believe large wooden treadwheel cranes may have been used in harbour zones, powered entirely by human walking motion inside rotating wheels. Others argue that ramps, rollers, sledges, and compound pulley systems distributed the loads gradually. Yet no surviving written manual explains exactly how Assos exported stone coffins at such scale. Comparisons with other ancient transport mysteries are unavoidable. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan weighs more than 1,000 tons and demonstrates Egyptian stone-cutting ambition. The trilithon blocks of Baalbek each exceed 800 tons and still challenge modern explanations. Easter Island's Moai statues were transported across volcanic terrain using methods researchers continue debating today. Assos belongs to the same category of ancient engineering paradoxes. Societies with supposedly limited technology repeatedly handling materials modern construction teams would still respect. Another unresolved mystery surrounds the necropolis layout itself. In many ancient cities, the dead were deliberately positioned along approach roads so travelers entering the city would confront generations of ancestors before reaching the living population. At Assos, sarcophagi lined major access routes overlooking the Aegean Sea. Death became part of the urban landscape. Some archaeologists suspect this arrangement also served commercial purposes. Foreign merchants arriving by sea would immediately see enormous stone coffins displayed outside the city walls, effectively advertising Assos craftsmanship before trade negotiations even began. The necropolis may have functioned simultaneously as cemetery, monument, and industrial showroom. Environmental durability adds another layer of mystery. Assos sits within an active seismic region exposed to salt air, humidity shifts, and strong Aegean winds. Over 2 millennia, many softer stone structures across the Mediterranean suffered catastrophic erosion. Sandstone monuments at Petra lost enormous surface detail due to wind abrasion and water infiltration. Yet numerous Assos sarcophagi remained structurally recognizable despite constant coastal exposure. Geologists believe the volcanic composition of the andesite contributed to this survival. Fine-grained igneous rock often resists weather penetration better than porous sedimentary stone. However, durability alone does not fully explain the preservation quality. Some lid joints remain surprisingly stable despite centuries of earthquakes affecting western Anatolia. The industrial implications may be the most overlooked mystery of all. Assos was not merely carving isolated luxury tombs. Evidence suggests organized extraction zones, standardized coffin forms, labor specialization, and export coordination across international trade networks. In other words, the city operated something resembling a proto-industrial stone manufacturing economy centuries before the Industrial Revolution. That raises uncomfortable historical questions. Ancient societies are often imagined as technologically primitive compared to the modern world. Yet places like Assos repeatedly reveal systems of engineering organization, resource management, and material science that appear far more advanced than simplistic historical narratives suggest. The workers of Assos understood quarry stress, transport balance, stone durability, and decomposition behavior well enough to create products desired across an empire stretching thousands of kilometers. Do you think the people of Assos truly understood the strange properties of these flesh-eating stones? Or was it an ancient discovery they used without ever knowing the science behind it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In eastern Anatolia, beside the immense blue waters of Lake Van, a wall of stone rises abruptly from the landscape. At first glance, it looks less like a fortress and more like a natural mountain split open by geological violence. But carved into the side of that cliff are stairways, chambers, inscriptions, and defensive walls belonging to Tushpa Fortress, the ancient capital of the Urartian kingdom, built nearly 3,000 years ago. What makes Tushpa so unsettling is not simply its age, it is the engineering. Even today, archaeologists and structural historians still debate how a civilization of the early Iron Age managed to carve, transport, and construct on terrain that modern engineers would consider extremely hostile. The first large-scale modern investigations of Tushpa began in the 19th century when European explorers traveling through the Ottoman Empire documented strange inscriptions cut high into the cliffs above Van. Early travelers believed the ruins belonged to Assyrians because the writing resembled Mesopotamian cuneiform. But in the 1820s and later through expeditions in the 1870s, researchers discovered that the inscriptions referenced kings of a previously misunderstood civilization, Urartu. Each excavation season revealed something new. One expedition uncovered rock-cut royal tombs hidden deep within the mountain. Another revealed massive cisterns and hydraulic channels. Later surveys found defensive terraces and stone foundations stretching across the cliffside, proving that Tushpa had once been a heavily fortified royal complex rather than a simple military outpost. The deeper archaeologists dug into Tushpa, the stranger the fortress became. The first mystery was the mountain itself. The citadel stands on a limestone ridge more than 100 meters high and nearly 2 kilometers long. The slopes are steep enough that in many areas even modern climbing equipment is required for safe access. Yet the Urartians somehow transformed this natural rock formation into a functioning royal capital. They carved staircases directly into vertical stone faces, some with remarkably even step geometry, despite severe erosion over thousands of years. In certain sections, the cuts are so straight that researchers compared them to later Roman quarrying techniques, even though the Romans would not dominate Anatolia until centuries later. This is where the technological debate begins. Iron Age tools in the 9th century BCE were still relatively primitive compared to later classical civilizations. Experimental archaeologists attempting to reproduce Urartian stone-cutting methods found that shaping hard limestone with early iron chisels required enormous labor and produced inconsistent surfaces. But many chambers in Tuxpa display unusually smooth internal walls and sharply defined angles. Some cuts run several meters with almost no visible deviation. That level of precision becomes even more difficult to explain, considering many of these chambers were carved in confined spaces with minimal natural light. Among the most mysterious discoveries were the royal tomb chambers hidden inside the rock. These rooms were not built with stacked stone blocks like Egyptian pyramids or Mycenaean tombs. Instead, they were excavated directly into the mountain itself. The entrances are positioned high above the ground, accessible only through narrow carved pathways. Archaeologists still debate how workers transported tools, food, water, and illumination equipment into those spaces during construction. Some tombs contain ceilings and corners, approaching near-perfect geometric symmetry. Even slight angular errors during excavation would have ruined the chambers permanently because the rooms were carved from solid bedrock rather than assembled piece by piece. The engineering challenge becomes even more astonishing when compared to other ancient cliff structures. Persian royal tombs at Naqsh-e-Rostam also used rock-cut architecture, but most date centuries later than Tuxpa. Egyptian burial chambers often relied on broader excavation corridors and flatter terrain. Tuxpa combined elevation, confined carving spaces, and steep mountain geometry all at once, making the fortress one of the most technically difficult construction sites of the ancient Near East. Then came the water mystery. Tuxpa overlooks Lake Van, but the fortress itself sits far above the shoreline on dry, exposed stone. A large settlement at that elevation would require enormous quantities of water for drinking, storage, livestock and defense. Yet excavations uncovered reservoirs, cisterns, and evidence of sophisticated hydraulic systems integrated into the fortress. Researchers believe the Urartians connected Tuxpa to broader canal networks built throughout the kingdom. The most famous example is the Menua Canal, an engineering project more than 50 kilometers long that still carries water in some areas nearly 28 centuries later. What astonishes engineers is the precision of those gradients. Modern hydraulic analysis showed that several Urartian canals maintained carefully controlled slopes that allowed water to flow steadily without destroying the channel walls through erosion. In some sections, the incline variation is measured in fractions of a degree across long distances. Comparable hydraulic accuracy would later become famous in Roman aqueduct systems. Yet the Urartians achieved similar functionality centuries earlier in mountainous terrain, using surveying methods that remain poorly understood. Some archaeologists believe the Urartians used primitive astronomical alignment and long-distance sighting techniques to calculate elevation changes. Others argue they developed practical engineering traditions through generations of trial and error. But no theory fully explains how such precise hydraulic control was maintained over rugged volcanic terrain without advanced instruments. But Tuxpa's greatest strength may have been its military engineering. Most ancient fortresses relied on walls. Tuxpa weaponized geography itself. Instead of leveling the mountain, the Urartians modified the terrain to create defensive choke points, steep approach corridors, and elevated firing positions. Certain access routes force attackers into narrow, exposed pathways, overlooked from above. Military historians have compared aspects of Tuxpa's defensive logic to medieval hill fortresses built over 1,000 years later. The difference is that Urartu developed these concepts during a period when organized siege warfare was still evolving across much of the Near East. The layout suggests a sophisticated understanding of visibility, movement restriction, and terrain manipulation. Even today, modern soldiers studying ancient warfare note that assaulting Tuxpa directly would have been devastatingly difficult without prolonged siege tactics. In many places, gravity itself became part of the fortress defense system. Excavators also discovered enormous stone blocks positioned in places that remain difficult to explain. Some wall sections contain multi-ton stones transported onto elevated terraces where maneuvering space is extremely limited. The region surrounding Lake Van is rugged, uneven, and prone to severe winter conditions. Traditional theories suggest the Urartians used wooden rollers, sledges, and earthen ramps. However, no experimental reconstruction has fully demonstrated how those techniques could consistently move such heavy material onto the steepest areas of the fortress without catastrophic collapse or loss of control. Comparisons with Inca stone transport in Peru often emerge in academic discussions because both civilizations operated in mountainous environments. But while the Inca relied heavily on polygonal masonry and broader mountain roads, Tuxpa's terrain is narrower and more vertically restrictive. That difference makes the logistics of Urartian construction even harder to reconstruct experimentally. Adding to the mystery are the inscriptions carved directly into exposed cliff faces. One of the most famous texts belongs to King Sarduri. The inscription sits high above the ground in a location so difficult to access that early travelers required ropes just to approach it. Yet the cuneiform characters are strikingly uniform in depth and spacing. Creating such inscriptions would have required stable platforms or scaffolding systems, but almost no physical evidence of those support structures survived. Historians suspect the Urartians developed advanced wooden scaffolding techniques adapted specifically for cliff construction, though the exact methods remain unknown. The precision of the inscriptions is especially important because uneven carving on exposed stone normally leads to accelerated erosion. Yet many Urartian characters remain legible after nearly 3,000 years of wind exposure, temperature shifts, and seismic activity around Lake Van. La Cabana Fortress rises above the entrance of Havana Bay like a stone wall built for an empire that feared the entire Caribbean collapsing around it. Constructed by Spain after the British captured Havana in 1762, the fortress stretches across more than 700 meters of elevated coastline and once housed thousands of soldiers and cannons. But the real mystery is not its size. It is the fact that this massive structure was built on unstable coastal limestone, exposed to salt water, hurricanes, tropical humidity, artillery fire, and centuries of erosion. Yet large sections still remain structurally intact more than 250 years later. Modern engineers studying the fortress discovered something unsettling. Many of its construction techniques appear surprisingly advanced for the 18th century, resembling ideas used in modern military engineering, passive cooling systems, hydraulic management, and even self-repairing construction materials. After Britain briefly seized Havana during the 7 Years' War, Spain realized the city's defenses were catastrophically vulnerable. In response, Spanish military engineers began constructing La Cabana in 1763 on a rocky ridge overlooking the harbour. Historical records estimate that thousands of workers, enslaved labourers, and military engineers spent more than a decade completing the fortress. At first, Historians viewed La Cabana as simply another colonial stronghold, but 20th century archaeological surveys and structural analyses began revealing anomalies beneath the walls. Engineers found unusually sophisticated drainage systems, strangely resilient mortar compositions, and geometric defensive designs that seemed far ahead of their time. The deeper researchers looked, the more the fortress resembled a giant engineering experiment hidden inside a military structure. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding La Cabana is how it was able to survive at all on its original foundation. The fortress sits atop karst limestone, a porous geological formation filled with underground cavities, fractures, and weak zones caused by water erosion. Even modern construction projects struggle on karst terrain because heavy structures can collapse into hidden voids beneath the surface. Yet La Cabana carries millions of kilograms of stone across this unstable ground, with surprisingly little large-scale deformation. Geological surveys suggest Spanish engineers may have created layered compression foundations using crushed coral, compacted lime, clay mixtures, and interlocking stone beds that distributed pressure across wider areas. Some researchers compare the system to primitive forms of modern load dispersal foundations used in coastal engineering today. What makes this remarkable is timing. Soil mechanics as a scientific discipline did not formally emerge until the 19th and 20th centuries. Yet La Cabana's builders appear to have understood concepts related to weight distribution, vibration absorption, and terrain stabilization generations earlier. Several structural engineers who modeled the fortress digitally concluded that certain retaining walls may intentionally flex slightly during seismic vibrations and ground movement rather than resisting rigidly. That flexibility may be one reason the structure survived for centuries while many rigid colonial buildings collapsed elsewhere in the Caribbean. The fortress walls themselves contain another mystery. At first glance, they appear like ordinary defensive barriers. But ballistic simulations performed by military historians revealed something unusual about their geometry. Many outer walls are angled in ways that reduce the direct transfer of kinetic energy from cannon impacts. Instead of receiving artillery force head-on, the sloped surfaces redirect part of the impact sideways. In modern engineering, this principle is similar to energy dissipation geometry used in blast-resistant structures. Some simulations suggest certain wall sections could reduce destructive impact forces by nearly 40% compared to flat vertical walls of similar thickness. The walls were also built extraordinarily thick in some areas, exceeding 6 meters. Combined with internal earth-filled reinforcement zones, they acted almost like primitive shock absorbers. This becomes even more impressive when considering 18th century limitations. There were no computers, no modern stress calculations, and no digital modeling software. Yet the fortress demonstrates a surprisingly advanced understanding of force behavior under repeated bombardment. Historians still debate whether these features came from accumulated battlefield experience or from engineering principles now partially forgotten. Beneath La Cabana lies a maze of tunnels, chambers, storage vaults, and gunpowder rooms that continue to puzzle researchers. Havana's climate creates enormous engineering problems for black powder storage. Average humidity levels often exceed 80%, conditions capable of destroying gunpowder effectiveness within relatively short periods. Yet Spanish military documents indicate that La Cabana stored enormous quantities of powder while maintaining operational readiness for long periods. Modern airflow studies suggest the fortress used passive ventilation techniques based on temperature differences between shaded stone chambers and ocean-facing air inlets. Cold air moved through lower tunnels while warmer air escaped through elevated openings, creating a continuous circulation system without mechanical assistance. In some chambers, airflow remains detectable even today. Architectural historians compare the design to passive cooling systems used in Middle Eastern wind towers and modern sustainable architecture. However, La Cabana integrated these concepts into a massive military fortress centuries before climate-controlled infrastructure existed. Some underground sections also appear positioned to minimize moisture condensation naturally. That level of environmental control suggests the builders understood humidity behavior far better than previously believed. Perhaps the most controversial mystery at La Cabana involves its mortar. Most coastal fortresses exposed to salt water and humidity eventually suffer catastrophic cracking. Salt penetrates microscopic fractures, expands over time, and weakens structural bonds. This process destroys countless historical buildings worldwide, but many sections of La Cabana show an unusual phenomenon. Tiny cracks inside the mortar appear partially resealed by newly formed mineral deposits. Laboratory analysis found that the fortress mortar contains high concentrations of lime, coral fragments, volcanic minerals, and microscopic calcium-rich particles. When seawater enters small fractures, chemical reactions trigger calcite crystal growth inside the cracks themselves. In other words, the material may slowly repair portions of its own damage. Modern material scientists call similar behavior autogenous healing or self-healing lime mortar. Researchers today are actively attempting to recreate such systems for sustainable concrete technology because global concrete deterioration costs hundreds of billions of dollars annually. What makes La Cabana extraordinary is that its builders may have accidentally, or intentionally, created a primitive version of this process over 2 centuries ago. Some mortar samples demonstrated compressive durability far exceeding expectations for materials continuously exposed to tropical marine conditions. In several areas, the inner structural core remains surprisingly dense despite visible surface erosion. Comparisons are often made with Roman marine concrete, which also grows stronger over time through seawater-triggered mineral reactions. Roman harbour structures have survived nearly 2,000 years, partly because volcanic ash mixtures formed durable crystalline compounds inside the concrete. La Cabana may represent a similar phenomenon in the Caribbean world, a forgotten material technology hidden inside colonial architecture. To this day, researchers still debate whether the formula resulted from deliberate experimentation or fortunate coincidence. A fortress under siege could survive only as long as its water supply lasted. Archaeologists discovered that La Cabana contains an elaborate rainwater harvesting and underground storage system, connected by carefully angled channels. Water moved entirely through gravity without pumps or mechanical lifting systems. Several reservoirs remained functional even after centuries. Hydraulic specialists studying the system noted that some channel gradients appear remarkably precise, maintaining controlled water flow while minimizing sediment accumulation. Similar engineering principles were used in Roman aqueducts and Persian qanat systems. The existence of such sophisticated water management inside a Caribbean military fortress demonstrates that the builders were not merely constructing walls, they were engineering a self-sustaining defensive machine. What do you think made La Cabana so advanced for its time? Forgotten engineering knowledge, lost materials technology, or something historians still haven't fully understood? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Perched above the Alhama River in La Rioja, northern Spain, Contrebia-Lucard may at first seem like just another ruined Iron Age hill fort, yet beneath its weathered cliffs lies one of the most remarkable engineering landscapes created by the Celtiberians. Long before Roman rule reached this region, an entire fortified city was carved directly into living sandstone, leaving behind construction methods that archaeology can describe but still cannot fully explain. The ruins were known locally for centuries, but systematic archaeological investigation only began during the 20th century, with extensive excavations from the 1970s onward, revealing streets, defensive systems, reservoirs, dwellings, and public spaces preserved beneath accumulated sediment. Stratigraphic analysis, ceramic typology, and Roman historical sources indicate that the settlement flourished between approximately the 4th century BCE and the 1st century BCE, before gradually declining after Roman control of the region became firmly established. Every excavation season has exposed additional evidence that the visible ruins represent only part of a far larger urban plan, concealed within the rock itself. What immediately separates Contribia Leucade from nearly every other Celtiberian settlement is that its builders did not simply construct on top of a mountain, they reshaped the mountain into the city. Instead of leveling the summit with imported fill or raising massive masonry platforms, they transformed the natural sandstone bedrock into streets, stairways, building foundations, storage chambers, drainage channels, and defensive features by removing enormous quantities of solid rock. Modern archaeologists can measure the finished surfaces with remarkable precision, but they still cannot reconstruct exactly how Iron Age engineers achieved such extensive modification using the technology available more than 2,000 years ago. Sandstone is softer than granite, yet it remains a durable sedimentary rock that demands sustained labor, accurate planning, and effective tools to produce long, flat surfaces across an entire settlement. This raises one of the site's greatest mysteries. Every street appears to belong to a coordinated urban design rather than centuries of random expansion. Pathways connect residential districts with storage areas, defensive sectors and water facilities while following gradients that remain practical even today. Such organization suggests that the builders possessed a comprehensive master plan before excavation even began. Unlike Roman colonies, however, no written plans, surveying manuals, or administrative records survive to explain how measurements were transferred across the irregular mountain surface. Historians assume that ropes, wooden stakes, simple leveling instruments, and accumulated practical experience guided the work, yet none of these temporary construction systems have survived in the archaeological record. What remains is the finished geometry, while the engineering process itself has almost completely disappeared. As researchers continued examining the settlement, another remarkable achievement emerged from beneath the rock. Much of the city's infrastructure was integrated directly into the same sandstone mass, instead of being added afterward. Reservoirs, cisterns, wells, and narrow channels were carefully carved into the bedrock to collect and distribute water throughout the settlement. Northern Spain experiences highly seasonal rainfall, making reliable storage essential for survival during dry periods and prolonged military sieges. Hydrological studies indicate that several channels were designed with gradients gentle enough to maintain water flow while minimizing erosion, demonstrating practical knowledge of hydraulic behavior. Although the principles involved can be explained scientifically today, archaeologists still debate how Iron Age builders calculated these gradients across an uneven landscape without modern surveying equipment. Their success becomes even more impressive because portions of the drainage network continue directing rainwater efficiently after more than 2 millennia of natural weathering. The defensive system surrounding Contribia Leucade adds another layer to the engineering puzzle. Rather than relying solely on masonry walls, the inhabitants excavated a monumental rock-cut ditch separating vulnerable approaches from the fortified plateau. Archaeological surveys estimate that this trench extended for nearly 700 meters, reaching widths of roughly 8 to 9 meters and depths approaching 8 meters in some sections. Excavating such dimensions required removing tens of thousands of cubic meters of sandstone. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that iron chisels and hammers are capable of cutting sandstone, but reproducing a ditch of this scale would require an enormous labor force working continuously for years. Surprisingly, archaeologists have not identified equally massive spoil deposits nearby. The missing waste rock has generated several hypotheses. Some researchers believe much of the excavated material was reused for construction elsewhere within the settlement, while others suggest centuries of erosion dispersed the debris downslope. Neither explanation fully accounts for the quantity of stone that must originally have been extracted. Roman historians provide additional context for the city's formidable reputation. Titus Livius, better known as Livy, described campaigns in Celtiberia during the 2nd century BCE in which fortified settlements repeatedly resisted Roman armies, despite their superior military organization. Although historical accounts must always be interpreted carefully, archaeological evidence confirms that Contrebia Lucard possessed one of the most sophisticated defensive layouts in the region. Attackers approaching the settlement would have encountered narrow access routes, elevated observation points, steep natural cliffs, and the immense rock-cut ditch before reaching the main fortifications. The surrounding landscape itself became part of the defensive architecture, demonstrating an understanding that terrain could be engineered as effectively as walls. Equally fascinating is the city's sophisticated approach to controlling water during storms. Rain falling across the plateau did not simply erode buildings or accumulate unpredictably. Instead, carefully carved channels redirected runoff toward designated collection points while protecting residential areas from destructive flooding. Modern geomorphological analysis shows that erosion patterns around many excavated sectors remain surprisingly limited considering more than 2,000 years of exposure. Such preservation reflects not only the durability of sandstone but also the effectiveness of the original drainage design. Whether these systems resulted from generations of practical experimentation or from highly specialized engineering knowledge passed between craftsmen remains unknown because no written Celtiberian technical texts have ever been discovered. Construction logistics remain perhaps the most difficult question of all. Every surface visible today represents the final stage of an immense engineering project, yet almost every temporary element required to complete that project has vanished. Wooden scaffolding decays, rope disappears, measuring stakes rot, and earthen working platforms erode into the landscape. Archaeologists, therefore, study negative evidence, attempting to reconstruct vanished construction methods solely from finished stonework. Tool marks preserved on some carved surfaces indicate repeated impact from iron implements, but they cannot reveal workforce organization, construction schedules, or management techniques. Large-scale public works require planning, food supplies, skilled supervision, and coordinated labor, suggesting that Contrebia Lucard possessed a social organization considerably more sophisticated than its surviving material culture alone might imply. Excavations found imported pottery, local ceramics, metal items, and other objects, showing the city was part of wide trade networks across Iberia and the Western Mediterranean. Its people weren't isolated, but trade alone doesn't explain why its engineering is so different. While rock-cut features exist elsewhere, nowhere else forms a whole city carved so deeply into stone, leaving the origins of this knowledge still unclear. In the mountains of southwestern China, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 3 political centers that had once controlled vast territories without functioning as ordinary imperial cities. Laoxicheng lies beside the Lingxi River in Yongshun County, Hunan. Tangya stands in Jianfeng County, Hubei, and Heilongtun occupies a fortified mountain position near Zunyi in Guizhou. Excavations revealed administrative compounds, roads, tombs, drainage channels, defensive walls, and monumental gateways belonging to hereditary regional rulers known as Tusi. Together, the 3 sites cover more than 780 hectares and were added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2015. Yet the buildings they left behind raise a difficult question. How were complex cities and fortresses engineered across some of China's most unstable and inaccessible terrain? The Tusi were local hereditary leaders recognized by successive Chinese governments, particularly during the Yuan and Ming periods. They governed minority populations while formally accepting imperial authority, creating political centers that combined local building traditions with architectural ideas associated with the central China. Lao Zicheng served the Pang rulers for nearly 6 centuries, while Tangya became the capital of the Qin domain during the 14th century. Heilongtun was different. Built as the military center of the powerful Bozhou chiefdom, it became a mountain fortress, whose ruins preserve one of the clearest examples of terrain-based defensive engineering in the region. Heilongtun was established in the 13th century on Longyan Mountain, at an elevation of approximately 1,300 meters. The fortified area covered roughly 1.5 square kilometers, while walls and defensive lines extended for several kilometers across ridges surrounded by cliffs. Access was restricted through a sequence of gates positioned along narrow approaches. Historical and archaeological evidence indicates that the fortress was destroyed in 1600, when Ming forces defeated the Bozhou rebellion, but large sections of the stone infrastructure survived the assault, fire, vegetation, and more than 4 centuries of erosion. The survival of these structures begins with geology. Heilongtun stands in a karst landscape where limestone is fractured by joints, underground cavities, and water erosion. Such terrain offers natural protection, but it is not automatically suitable for heavy construction. A wall placed above a hidden fracture can settle unevenly, while rain entering cracks can weaken foundations and trigger slope failure. The builders therefore had to distinguish stable rock from weathered surfaces before positioning gates, retaining walls, and elevated compounds. Archaeology reveals the completed structures, but no surviving survey instruments, construction manuals, or detailed engineering records explain how those decisions were made. This uncertainty becomes more striking when the defensive layout is examined as a single system. Heilongtun contained 9 principal passes, traditionally described as 6 on the eastern approach and 3 on the western side. They were not arranged as identical gateways along a regular perimeter. Instead, each was fitted into a different section of the mountain, forcing attackers through steep climbs, narrow turns, and enclosed spaces before they could approach the inner compound. The walls did not simply separate the fortress from the landscape. They converted cliffs, ridges, and ravines into parts of the fortification itself. Designing such a system required accurate knowledge of visibility, movement, and range. A gate placed only a few meters too far forward could create a blind area, while a poorly supported wall could collapse under its own weight or under the pressure of wet soil behind it. The irregularity of the terrain meant that builders could not repeat a single standard plan. Every section required separate adjustment, yet the surviving layout suggests that these adjustments formed a coordinated defensive sequence rather than a collection of unrelated barriers. What remains unclear is whether that coordination was established through measured plans, scale models, inherited rules of construction, or continuous decisions made directly on the mountain. The movement of stone presents an even more physical mystery. Walls, gates, stairs, and foundations required enormous quantities of limestone. Some material could be extracted locally, reducing horizontal transport, but quarrying near the building area created another problem because removing too much rock could destabilize the ground supporting the fortifications. Blocks then had to be shaped, lifted, and positioned on steep slopes where wheeled vehicles would have been of limited use. Wooden sledges, rollers, ropes, lever systems, and temporary ramps are all technically plausible, yet the temporary structures needed for such operations have left little archaeological evidence. Transporting stone was only one part of the challenge. Large construction projects also required timber, lime, metal tools, water, and food for a concentrated labor force. At more than 1,000 meters above sea level, every worker and animal consumed supplies that had to climb the same restricted routes used for building materials. Storage had to be protected from rain and spoilage, while construction schedules had to account for seasonal weather. The fortress demonstrates that such a logistical system existed, but the administrative records needed to reconstruct its scale, labour organisation and rate of construction have not survived. Water was both essential and dangerous. Southwestern China receives substantial seasonal rainfall, and mountain surfaces can rapidly direct runoff toward walls and courtyards. Without controlled drainage, water pressure builds behind retaining structures, soil becomes saturated, and foundations begin to move. The Tusi sites preserve drainage ditches, culverts and channels integrated with roads and architectural compounds. Tangya is especially important because its surviving remains include boundary walls, paved roads, and drainage installations that reveal how water management formed part of the urban plain, rather than being added only after construction. At Laoxicheng, the engineering problem was different but equally complex. The city developed beside a river within a mountainous valley and contained administrative, residential, ceremonial and burial zones connected by an organized network of streets. Its core archaeological area covers more than 250,000 square meters, while the wider cultural landscape extends across approximately 25 square kilometers. Excavated remains include streets, city walls, temples, tombs, monumental arches and drainage systems, indicating that Laoxicheng functioned as a carefully structured capital rather than a loosely assembled mountain settlement. Building beside a river provided water and transport, but it also exposed the city to flooding, erosion and sediment movement. Roads had to follow the slope while remaining passable, and channels needed sufficient gradient to remove runoff without cutting into foundations. If their angle was too shallow, sediment would accumulate and block the system. If it was too steep, fast-moving water could erode the channels themselves. The preserved drainage network shows that the builders understood these practical relationships, although archaeologists cannot determine whether flow was estimated through formal calculation or through generations of observation. The organization of Laoxicheng adds another unresolved dimension. Its roads and compounds adapted to the valley instead of imposing a perfect rectangular grid. Administrative buildings occupied prominent positions, while ritual areas, residential quarters and elite tombs were separated yet connected. This required more than architectural skill. The planners had to predict how people, goods, animals and water would move through a confined landscape over long periods. The city appears to have grown across several phases, but researchers still face the problem of distinguishing an original master plan from a system that became coherent through repeated expansion. Tangya provides a smaller comparison. Built during the 14th century, it represented a lower-ranking Tusi domain and occupied a more modest area than Laoxicheng or Heilongtun. Even so, excavations revealed an administration zone, stone roads, boundary structures, tombs, drainage ditches and monumental remains. The difference in scale is valuable because it suggests that certain planning principles were not limited to the wealthiest rulers. Smaller domains also used durable stone infrastructure and organized water control, raising the possibility that Tusi builders shared technical traditions across political boundaries. However, similarities do not prove that the same engineers worked at all three places. Local geology, ethnic traditions, and political rank produced clear architectural differences. Heilongtun was dominated by military defense, Laoxicheng by the functions of a regional capital, and Tangya by a more compact administrative order. The unanswered question is whether these sites followed a common body of technical knowledge, or whether comparable solutions emerged independently because builders faced similar environmental pressures. Systematic excavations began in 1972 on the Castro de Santander hill near Canavruelas in Spain's Cuenca province. What emerged was not the Celtiberian stronghold described by the Roman historian Livy, but a later Roman city occupying a strategic promontory above the Guadiana River. Spread across approximately 20 hectares and enclosed by defensive walls, Erkavica had been laid out as a planned settlement with paved streets, houses, public buildings, and a monumental civic centre. Yet the deeper archaeologists excavated, the more difficult it became to explain how such an orderly city had been imposed upon this uneven and geologically complex hill. Livy first mentioned Erkavica during the campaign of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus in 179 BC, describing it as a powerful Celtiberian city that surrendered after several days of resistance. The problem is that excavations at Castro de Santander have produced little material securely predating the second half of the 1st century BC. This has led some researchers to suspect that the original Celtiberian settlement stood elsewhere, possibly at Muela de Alcoche, a 37-hectare site roughly 6 kilometers upstream that is now partly affected by the Buendia Reservoir. Roman Erkavica may therefore have been an entirely new city that inherited the name and political territory of an older centre whose exact location remains disputed. That possibility makes the urban design even more remarkable. Roman Erkavica was founded ex novo, with streets arranged in an orthogonal pattern despite the fact that the hill was neither flat nor geometrically regular. Geological surveys describe the site as an elongated elevation composed of clays, sandstones and limestone beds dipping by less than 10 degrees toward the east. These materials do not behave uniformly under structural loads. Clay expands and contracts with changing moisture. Sandstone erodes along weaker layers, and limestone can fracture or channel water through hidden joints. Before a single monumental building could rise, surveyors had to decide which zones could support masonry, where slopes required modification, and how rainwater would move beneath streets and foundations. The visible city suggests that this assessment was extraordinarily effective, but no construction plan survives to show how it was achieved. Roman surveyors possessed instruments such as the groma for establishing right angles, the dioptra for measuring directions, and the chorobates for checking gradients. These devices explain the principles of Roman surveying, yet they do not reveal the exact working sequence used at Erkavica. On a hill where the natural surface constantly rises, falls, and changes composition, a regular street grid could not simply be marked out and built. Elevations had to be transferred across obstructed ground, slopes had to be cut or filled, and the alignment of one district had to remain consistent with another, even when the surveyors could not see the entire city from a single position. This challenge becomes clearest around the Forum, where architecture was used to manufacture level space rather than merely occupy it. The civic centre included a rectangular paved square, porticos, a judicial basilica, shops, and a monumental eastern extension supported by a two-level cryptoporticus. A cryptoporticus is partly an underground structure, but at Erkavica it also functioned as an enormous artificial platform. Instead of following the hillside, the builders created a horizontal surface above it, transferring the weight of paving, columns, walls, and crowds into lower masonry that had to resist both vertical loading and lateral pressure from the surrounding ground. The engineering logic can be reconstructed in general terms, but many practical details remain invisible. The builders must have controlled the thickness of foundations, selected stones according to their position, and allowed water to escape from behind retaining structures. Otherwise, saturated earth would have increased pressure against the walls and gradually forced them outward. Yet the temporary works needed for such construction have vanished. No complete lifting system, scaffold network or transport ramp survives, and archaeology preserves the finished platform far more clearly than the sequence that produced it. What remains is the result of calculations that were never written down at the site. The same precision appears in the residential districts. Houses were arranged within blocks defined by cobbled streets, while major routes followed the principal north-south and east-west axes. The so-called House of the Doctor was organised around an atrium with an impluvium, a sunken basin designed to receive rainwater from the roof. This familiar Roman feature was more than decoration. It formed part of a controlled hydraulic circuit in which roof geometry, gutter position, floor slope and underground storage all had to work together. A small error in gradient could send water into adjoining rooms, undermine wall foundations, or leave stagnant pools within the house. At Archaeology, water management was not optional. The city stood on elevated ground selected for defense and visibility, not because it offered an abundant river beside every neighborhood. The Guadiella flowed below the hill, but raising large quantities of water to the settlement would have demanded sustained labor or mechanical lifting. Rainfall could be collected from roofs, courtyards, and paved surfaces, yet seasonal collection required storage capacity and careful protection against contamination. Cisterns, basins, drains, and domestic impluvia therefore reveal an integrated response, although the complete supply network has not been recovered. This uncertainty is important because the surviving hydraulic features show that the inhabitants understood water as an urban system rather than a collection of isolated structures. Streets had to shed stormwater without eroding their surfaces. Houses needed drainage that would not discharge into neighbouring foundations. Public buildings required clean water while waste moved away through separate paths. Beneath this planning lay another difficulty. The hill's alternating beds of permeable and less permeable material could redirect water underground. Engineers who ignored those conditions risked creating hidden zones of saturation capable of weakening terraces and walls. The Roman solution often involved mortars made from lime, sand, and crushed ceramic material. In water-related structures, this mixture could produce opus signinum, a dense lining commonly used in cisterns, baths, channels, and pools. Crushed brick was not simply filler. Its silica and alumina-rich particles could react with lime in the presence of water, forming cementitious compounds that reduced permeability and increased long-term durability. Modern materials science describes this as a pozzolanic reaction, but the ancient builders reached the result without chemical formulas, standardized industrial kilns, or modern instruments for measuring grain size and moisture. Even so, describing the reaction does not recover the lost craft. The performance of such mortar depended on the quality of the lime, the firing temperature of the ceramic fragments, the ratio between aggregate and binder, the amount of water added and the length of curing. Craftsmen also had to prepare the underlying surface and apply the lining before the mixture lost workability. Laboratory analysis can identify mineral phases in surviving samples, yet it cannot fully reconstruct the decisions made during construction or explain how local workshops adapted their recipes to Archaeology's climate and raw materials. Stone transport presents a related problem. Monumental public buildings required large quantities of dressed limestone and other construction material to be moved onto the hill. The final distance from a quarry may have been modest, but the last stage of the journey was the most difficult because every block had to be hauled upward. Roman builders could use sledges, rollers, wooden cranes, capstans, and coordinated teams of labourers or animals. However, those are possibilities based on wider Roman practice, not a complete reconstruction supported by surviving equipment at Archaeology. The absence of machinery does not make the construction supernatural. It reveals how little temporary infrastructure normally survives. Wooden lifting frames decayed, ropes disappeared, earthen ramps were dismantled, and metal fittings were recycled. Archaeologists are therefore left with foundations and finished masonry from which they must work backward. Tool marks can suggest how stones were shaped, while wear patterns may indicate where loads were dragged, but neither provides the full logistical chain connecting quarry, workshop, transport route, and final placement. Geophysical research has added another layer to this investigation. Electrical resistivity and electromagnetic surveys have been used to detect buried variations beneath the site, allowing researchers to identify possible walls, voids, and architectural features without excavating every area. Such methods work because stone foundations, compacted floors, and moisture-filled deposits conduct electrical energy differently. The resulting maps demonstrate that much of Akavika remains hidden, meaning that interpretations of its streets, hydraulic network, and structural organization are still based on an incomplete sample of the city. On a fortified hill above the Navia River Valley in western Asturias, northern Spain, the ruins of Castro de Coana preserve one of the clearest surviving examples of an Iron Age settlement in Atlantic Europe. Known locally as the Castellón de Vilacondide, the site was already mentioned as an ancient ruin in 1818, but systematic investigation began in 1877, when José María Flores excavated more than 20 structures in what became the first formally studied hill fort in Asturias. Antonio García y Bellido and Juan Uría returned between 1940 and 1944, followed by further campaigns directed by Francisco Jorda from 1959 to 1961. What emerged was not a loose cluster of primitive huts, but a densely organized fortified community whose engineering had been underestimated for generations. Early researchers once believed that Coana had been founded after Rome conquered northwestern Iberia, largely because Roman pottery, coins, and other objects appeared among the ruins. Later excavations changed that chronology. Archaeological evidence now shows that the hill had already been fortified by at least the 5th century BC, centuries before the final Roman campaigns in northern Hispania between 29 and 19 BC. Occupation continued and changed under Roman influence, making Coana not a monument from a single moment, but a settlement repeatedly rebuilt over several centuries. This long sequence complicates almost every attempt to understand its technology, because walls, houses, and streets belonging to different phases were repaired, altered, and reused without leaving written plans. The excavated settlement is divided into 2 principal zones. At the summit stands a large oval enclosure, usually described as an acropolis, protected by a substantial defensive wall. Below it, the northern quarter contains more than 80 surviving buildings connected by narrow passages, paved areas, and small open spaces. Most houses are circular or oval, while several later constructions adopt more angular plans associated with changing social and Roman architectural traditions. The compact arrangement initially appears irregular, yet the buildings do not simply occupy every available space. They were fitted into the slope through retaining walls, step foundations, and carefully controlled circulation routes, creating a settlement whose organization responded precisely to the shape of the hill. This adaptation is one of Coana's deepest engineering puzzles. The builders had no concrete foundations, steel reinforcement, or modern instruments for calculating soil pressure, yet they established dozens of stone structures on uneven ground, exposed to persistent Atlantic rainfall. Each platform had to carry the weight of masonry walls, timber roofs, stored materials, and human activity without sliding downhill. Instead of cutting the entire hill into a regular grid, the builders used the natural contours, placing walls where the ground offered support and adding terraces where level surfaces were required. The result suggests generations of practical knowledge concerning drainage, load distribution and slope stability, although no measuring device, technical text or construction drawing has been recovered. The walls themselves reveal how this knowledge worked. Koana was built primarily from locally available stone laid without mortar. Stability depended on the contact between irregular pieces, the weight of the masonry and the careful arrangement of inner and outer wall faces around a packed core. Such dry stone construction can tolerate small movements because individual stones shift slightly instead of forcing the entire wall to crack as a rigid mass. It can also allow rainwater to pass through rather than building destructive pressure behind retaining structures. These properties help explain the survival of substantial sections for more than 2,000 years, but they do not reveal how ancient builders selected each stone, judged the correct wall thickness, or recognized unstable sections before failure occurred. This problem becomes more striking in the defensive zone. The upper enclosure was not protected by a symbolic boundary, but by a strong wall controlling the most important ground above the settlement. Constructing it required quarrying, moving and positioning large quantities of stone on a hill where wheeled transport would have been difficult. No ancient cranes, permanent ramps or transport vehicles have been found at Koana. Wooden sledges, rollers, levers, ropes and coordinated labour offer plausible explanations, but they will remain reconstructions based on comparable ancient technologies rather than direct evidence from the site. The finished fortification survives, while most of the temporary machines and wooden structures needed to build it disappeared completely. Rain created an equally serious challenge. Western Asturias has a humid Atlantic climate, and uncontrolled runoff would have entered houses, softened earthen floors and undermined terraces. Koana contains no monumental sewer system comparable to those of Roman cities, yet the settlement endured repeated wet seasons for centuries. Its drainage appears to have depended on the combined effects of sloping lanes, permeable masonry, raised thresholds, narrow channels and gaps between structures. Instead of collecting all water in a single engineered conduit, the settlement seems to have divided the flow into smaller paths directed around buildings and downhill through the street network. Archaeologists can identify parts of this system, but later erosion and reconstruction make it difficult to recover the complete hydraulic plan or determine whether it was designed from the beginning or improved gradually after observing floods. The circular houses present another example of apparently simple architecture concealing complex decisions. A curved wall distributes roof loads without the weak corners found in poorly constructed rectangular buildings, while a conical timber and thatch roof can transfer weight relatively evenly around the circumference. The shape also resists strong winds from multiple directions, an advantage in an exposed landscape. Yet circular construction creates practical problems of its own. The builders had to maintain a consistent radius without modern surveying tools, position doorways without weakening the wall and shape timber roofs so that forces remained balanced. The repeated appearance of buildings with comparable forms suggests shared building rules, but archaeologists have found no standard measuring rod or marked unit that would reveal how dimensions were controlled. The houses are also densely packed, sometimes separated by passages barely wide enough for movement. This arrangement reduced the length of defensive walls required to protect the population and may have limited exposure to wind, but it increased the danger of fire and made runoff more difficult to control. The builders therefore had to coordinate individual houses with the larger settlement, rather than treating each structure as an isolated project. Doorways faced selected lanes. Walls avoided blocking circulation and open areas were retained where domestic or communal work could take place. Such consistency implies organized decision-making, yet Koana has produced no palace, archive, or administrative building that clearly identifies who imposed these rules. The most technically unusual structures lie close to the entrance of the settlement, where archaeologists uncovered two buildings commonly interpreted as Castro saunas or steam baths. Related monuments appear in a limited zone of northwestern Iberia and are considered highly distinctive within European Iron Age archaeology. Their interiors were divided into spaces associated with heating, steam, and controlled movement, while stone construction helped retain temperature and withstand repeated exposure to moisture. The interpretation as steam baths is widely accepted, although their social meaning remains disputed. They may have served ritual purification, initiation, healing, or communal ceremonies rather than ordinary hygiene alone. Operating such a building required more than placing hot stones in a room. Fuel had to be burned without filling the occupied chamber with intolerable smoke. Heat had to pass into the bathing area, and steam needed to remain long enough to produce the intended effect without condensing immediately on cold surfaces. Openings, wall thickness, and the sequence of chambers would have influenced air circulation and temperature. Because timber roofs, doors, and internal fittings have vanished, the surviving masonry represents only part of the original machine. Modern reconstructions can explain how the bath may have functioned, but they cannot determine exactly where fires were maintained, how much water was introduced, what temperatures were reached, or how operators controlled the process. Koana also preserves evidence of ironworking, stoneworking, and other crafts, activities that demanded controlled supplies of raw material and fuel. Iron production required temperatures exceeding ordinary domestic fires, while forging depended on repeated heating and skilled control of airflow. Metal tools would have been essential for woodworking, agriculture, warfare, and the maintenance of buildings, yet the organization of production remains uncertain. Workshops may have served individual households, specialist families, or a broader authority, but the physical evidence is too incomplete to show how labor was divided or how technical knowledge moved between generations. In 1800, British surveyor Colin Mackenzie began documenting the ruins of Vijayanagara at Hampi in the present-day Indian state of Karnataka. Among the remains inside the royal centre stood an enormous terraced platform later identified with a ceremonial structure described by 16th century Portuguese visitors. Today it is known as the Mahanavami Dibba, the great platform from which Vijayanagara's rulers displayed imperial power before thousands of spectators. The surviving monument rises more than 10 metres above its surroundings and consists of 3 ascending levels, each faced with carefully assembled masonry and bands of carved reliefs. Its position was deliberately commanding. The platform occupied one of the highest points in the royal zone, overlooking spaces where processions, military reviews, animal displays, dances, and ceremonial gatherings could take place. Yet what visitors see today is only the stone base. Archaeological interpretation suggests that a pillared wooden pavilion once stood on the summit, but almost every trace of that superstructure disappeared when Vijayanagara was conquered and devastated in 1565. The engineering puzzle therefore begins with an incomplete building whose most important upper section has vanished. The platform was not constructed in a single operation. Architectural analysis indicates at least 3 major building phases extending across the Vijayanagara period. Earlier masonry was enlarged, covered, or incorporated into later additions, producing the stepped mass visible today. This means its builders were not working from an empty site. Each expansion had to carry new weight while preserving the stability of the structure beneath it. Without reinforced concrete, steel, framing, or modern geotechnical instruments, they created a platform that has remained standing for roughly 5 centuries despite monsoon rain, vegetation, stone removal, and the violent destruction of the royal capital. Exactly how the internal mass was organised remains less obvious than the external terraces suggest. The visible walls are not proof that the entire monument consists of solid, uniformly laid stone. Monumental platforms of this type could contain rubble packing, earth, secondary masonry, and retaining walls arranged in separate construction compartments. Such systems reduce the quantity of dress stone required, but they introduce another difficulty. Loose material can settle, absorb water, or push outward against the facing. The builders therefore needed to control both vertical loading and lateral pressure across a structure tens of meters wide. The platform's broad base, inward stepping profile, and thick retaining surfaces would have spread its weight gradually toward the ground. Yet no surviving Vijayanagara manual explains the calculations, construction sequence, or foundation preparation used here. The choice of material made the work even more demanding. Hampi lies within a landscape dominated by granite outcrops and immense weathered boulders, giving the builders access to durable local stone but not to material that was easy to shape. Granite is rich in hard minerals such as quartz and feldspar and cannot be carved as quickly as softer sandstone or limestone. Vijayanagara masons nevertheless produced long courses, stairways, mouldings, and extensive sculptural panels across the platform. Their likely tools included iron points, chisels, hammers and wedges, while repeated dressing and abrasion refined the surfaces. These methods are technically plausible and are consistent with wider South Indian stoneworking traditions, but archaeology has not reconstructed the precise division of labour or the time required to complete the platform's enormous carved exterior. The difficulty was not simply cutting individual blocks. Every piece had to enter a coordinated building sequence. Quarry workers first located stone without fractures severe enough to compromise it. Teams then separated blocks along natural weaknesses or prepared wedge lines, reduced unnecessary mass near the quarry, and transported the stone toward the royal centre. Even when the source lay nearby, moving multi-ton granite across uneven ground required prepared routes, timber supports, ropes, sledges, carts, or teams of draft animals. Elephants may have contributed pulling power, but popular images of elephants effortlessly lifting finished blocks oversimplify the problem. The heavier task was controlling movement so that stone did not accelerate, tilt, or crush the equipment beneath it. Raising blocks onto successive terraces presented another challenge. The most practical explanation is the use of temporary earthen ramps combined with levers and hauling systems, techniques known across many pre-industrial building traditions. Yet no intact construction ramp survives beside the Mahanavami Dibba, and no contemporary illustration shows the platform under construction. Because temporary works were normally dismantled and their materials reused, the finished monument preserves the result while concealing the infrastructure that produced it. This is not evidence of unknown machinery, but it leaves the exact logistical system unconfirmed. The platform stairways reveal how carefully circulation was integrated into the monument. Access was provided from more than one direction, but these approaches were not simple utility stairs. They controlled how rulers, attendants, and ceremonial participants moved between levels, transforming physical elevation into a political performance. A king ascending above the crowd became visible from a great distance, while those approaching him were forced through predetermined routes. The architecture therefore functioned simultaneously as a load-bearing structure, a viewing platform, and a machine for organizing human movement. This interpretation is strengthened by the account of Domingo Paes, a Portuguese visitor who observed Vijayanagara during the reign of Krishna Devaraya in the early 16th century. Paes described elaborate Mahanavami celebrations involving troops, horses, elephants, dancers, musicians, nobles, and royal ritual. The correspondence between these written descriptions and the reliefs carved around the platform is striking. Rows of elephants, mounted riders, hunters, warriors, acrobats and performers turn the stone base into a permanent representation of ceremonies once staged around it. Yet the carvings create a technical mystery of their own. The scenes stretch across different construction levels and appear to have been produced by several groups of sculptors, perhaps at different times, maintaining horizontal registers, repeated proportions, and a coherent visual rhythm required more than individual artistic skill. Supervisors must have established reference lines, panel dimensions and sequences before detailed carving began. Some reliefs were probably worked after blocks had been placed, while others may have been partly prepared on the ground. Distinguishing these stages from tool marks and unfinished surfaces is difficult, because centuries of weathering have softened many details. The imagery also suggests that the craftsmen were documenting a cosmopolitan imperial capital, rather than inventing a purely symbolic world. Camels, foreign-looking attendants, imported horses and varied clothing styles reflect Vijayanagara's connection to commercial networks extending through the Indian Ocean and the Deccan. Horses were especially important because high-quality war animals had to be imported into southern India, where climatic conditions limited large-scale breeding. Their repeated appearance on the monument was therefore both decorative and political, advertising the empire's ability to command distant trade, military resources, and specialized knowledge. Water management forms another essential part of the engineering context. The Mahanavami Dibba did not stand alone, but belonged to a carefully organized royal landscape containing tanks, channels, drains, and ceremonial water structures. Archaeological work near the platform uncovered a precisely constructed stepped tank supplied by a stone aqueduct. Surveys across the wider Vijayanagara metropolitan region also identified wells, cisterns, and hydraulic installations serving domestic, agricultural, ritual, and public needs. These discoveries demonstrate that the royal centre was integrated into a planned water network rather than dependent only on natural runoff. For the platform itself, drainage was crucial. A structure with broad horizontal surfaces exposed to seasonal monsoon rainfall could not safely allow water to penetrate its packed interior. Saturated fill would become heavier, encourage settlement, and increase outward pressure on retaining walls. The builders therefore had to shape surfaces, joints, and surrounding ground so that rainwater escaped before causing serious damage. The survival of the main mass suggests that these measures were broadly effective, but the original drainage arrangement cannot be reconstructed completely because upper pavements, wooden structures, and adjoining buildings have disappeared. The greatest missing element remains the pavilion that once stood above the stone terraces. Post sockets and comparisons with other Vijayanagara buildings indicate that the summit probably supported columns and a roof, creating a shaded ceremonial space for the ruler and his court. Because wood is lighter than stone, it allowed a large upper structure without placing impossible loads on the platform. It was also vulnerable to fire. When the city was attacked after the Battle of Talikota, palace buildings with timber columns, beams, and roof systems could be burned even when their stone foundation survived. What now appears to be an open monument was once only the lower skeleton of a far more complex architectural composition. The ruins of Itokazu Castle stand among the limestone hills of Nanjo on Okinawa Island, Japan, appearing modest compared with the famous castles of East Asia. Yet beneath its weathered stone walls lies one of the least understood engineering achievements of the Ryukyu Kingdom. Built between the 13th and 14th centuries, this fortress still raises questions that modern archaeology cannot fully answer, especially how its builders transformed one of the most unstable limestone landscapes into a defensive structure that has survived for more than 6 centuries. The site became known to modern archaeology through surveys of Okinawa's medieval asterisk, Gusuku asterisk, castles during the 20th century, and systematic excavations later confirmed that Itokazu belonged to the network of fortified settlements that protected the southern Ryukyu kingdom before its political unification in the early 15th century. Archaeologists uncovered sections of curtain walls, gateways, terraces, ceramics imported from China and Southeast Asia, and local Ryukyuan pottery, allowing the castle to be dated to the Gusuku period. Despite these discoveries, excavation has revealed remarkably little about the engineering methods behind the fortress itself, leaving the stonework to speak almost entirely for its forgotten builders. The greatest mystery begins with the landscape. Unlike castles constructed on broad hills or mountain ridges, Itokazu occupies an elevated platform formed from Ryukyu limestone, a coral-derived rock deposited during the Pleistocene and uplifted by tectonic activity over hundreds of thousands of years. Geological surveys show that this limestone is heavily affected by karst erosion, producing sinkholes, sharp ridges, underground cavities, fractures, and irregular slopes. Modern engineers generally avoid placing heavy masonry directly on such terrain because hidden voids and uneven load distribution can cause gradual settlement or sudden collapse. Yet the Ryukyu builders selected precisely this difficult landscape and somehow converted it into a remarkably stable foundation without leaving evidence of large-scale ground leveling. Instead of forcing the mountain to match a design, they appear to have designed every section of the castle around the mountain itself. Many surviving walls follow natural contours with almost mathematical precision, suggesting that the builders possessed an intimate understanding of the rock beneath their feet long before geological science existed. Exactly how they evaluated which areas could safely support several tons of stone remains completely unknown. That uncertainty becomes even more remarkable when examining the walls themselves. Much of Itokazu Castle was constructed using a technique known as asterisk nozurazumi asterisk, in which irregular natural stones are stacked without mortar. Unlike later Japanese castles that relied on carefully shaped blocks, these builders worked with stones of widely different dimensions while still producing walls capable of resisting gravity, heavy rainfall, earthquakes, and repeated typhoons. Engineers studying similar dry stone structures have demonstrated that stability depends not only on the weight of individual blocks, but also on the distribution of contact surfaces and internal friction throughout the entire wall. Every misplaced stone changes the forces acting on dozens of surrounding stones. At Itokazu, the walls appear to achieve this balance despite the absence of standardized block sizes. Some researchers believe the masons intentionally aligned each stone along natural fracture planes within the limestone, reducing stress concentrations and improving long-term stability. But no historical record survives to confirm whether this sophisticated practice was actually employed or whether it resulted from generations of accumulated practical experience. As the structure extends across the ridge, another pattern begins to emerge. Rather than imposing symmetrical geometry, nearly every wall bends gently with the landscape. The castle's layout appears irregular when viewed from above, yet field surveys reveal that entrances, terraces, defensive corners, and retaining walls consistently follow changes in elevation instead of ignoring them. This suggests that the builders prioritize structural efficiency over visual order. Modern topographic engineering follows the same principle because adapting construction to existing contours minimizes excavation while reducing instability caused by artificial cuts into the slope. It is remarkable that medieval builders working without modern surveying instruments produced a fortress displaying many of these same characteristics. Whether they relied on wooden leveling tools, observation, accumulated craftsmanship, or methods now entirely lost remains one of the unanswered questions surrounding the site. The defensive design also reflects an unexpectedly advanced understanding of terrain. Unlike many medieval fortifications that relied on massive moats or towering keeps, Itokazu transformed the surrounding landscape into the primary weapon. Steep limestone escarpments restricted movement, narrow passages forced attackers into confined spaces, and successive changes in direction prevented large formations from advancing efficiently. Archaeological mapping indicates that several gateways required approaching forces to slow down while exposing themselves from multiple directions simultaneously. This arrangement resembles defensive concepts found in much larger castles, despite being achieved largely through natural topography rather than monumental construction. Whether these passages were intentionally calculated through repeated military experience or simply evolved from adapting to the existing rock remains impossible to determine. The mountain itself conceals another mystery beneath the visible walls. Karst landscapes naturally develop underground caves as slightly acidic rainwater dissolves limestone over thousands of years. Beneath and around Itokazu lies a network of such cavities, some still only partially explored. Several entrances appear to have been modified by human activity, raising the possibility that natural caves became integrated into the castle's defensive system. Archaeologists have proposed that these underground spaces may have served as shelters, storage chambers, or concealed movement routes during periods of conflict, yet definitive evidence has never been recovered. The incomplete exploration of the cave system means the full relationship between the fortress above and the landscape below remains uncertain. Water management presents another engineering puzzle. Limestone rapidly absorbs rainfall through fractures, making permanent surface water scarce on elevated karst terrain. Any fortress expecting to withstand a siege required a dependable water supply, yet Itokazu sits on ground where rain disappears underground almost immediately. Small springs and water sources exist within the broader limestone region, but researchers continue debating how the castle maintained sufficient supplies during prolonged occupation. Some believe rainwater was directed toward naturally sealed depressions where it could be collected before infiltrating the rock, while others suggest access to groundwater through nearby karst springs. Without surviving hydraulic structures or written documentation, the precise solution remains unknown, although the continued occupation of the fortress strongly suggests that its inhabitants had developed an effective system adapted specifically to this challenging geology. Environmental resilience offers another clue to the builders' remarkable understanding of their surroundings. Okinawa experiences one of the most destructive typhoon climates in East Asia, with annual storms frequently producing winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour and intense seasonal rainfall. Such conditions accelerate erosion, destabilize slopes, and damage poorly constructed masonry. Even so, significant portions of Itokazu's stone walls remain standing after more than 600 years. Modern structural studies of dry stone walls show that slight flexibility can actually improve resistance to ground movement, because individual stones absorb and redistribute forces rather than transferring them through rigid mortar joints. Whether the Ryukyu builders intentionally exploited this mechanical advantage cannot be proven, but the fortress demonstrates that their construction methods were exceptionally well suited to Okinawa's severe environmental conditions.